Welcome, weary wanderer, to a journey through shadows and sorrow, where innocence meets its end in halls of mechanical wonder. Tonight, we explore the tragedy of a small child whose tears would echo through decades of horror, whose gentle spirit became the foundation upon which nightmares were built. This is the story of the crying child, told through eyes that saw too much, understood too little, and loved too deeply. So settle in, close your eyes when you're ready, and let us walk together through this tale of family, fear, and a boy who simply wanted to feel safe. There's no rush here, no need to fear the darkness we'll explore. Just let the story wash over you like a lullaby sung in minor keys. In the beginning, there was only love and the sweet promise of forever, painted in the warm colors of family dinners and birthday cakes, of bedtime stories and morning sunshine streaming through windows that had never known the shadow of tragedy. The Afton household stood like any other suburban dream in those golden days, its walls echoing with the ordinary magic of children's laughter and the comfortable sounds of parents who still believed that love could conquer any darkness the world might conjure. William Afton was, in those innocent days, simply a father with calloused hands and bright eyes, a man whose love for his children burned as steadily as his passion for creation. His workshop in the basement hummed with the gentle sounds of innovation, where springs and gears danced under his careful touch as he brought mechanical wonders to life. He was an inventor, a dreamer, a man who looked at the world and saw not what it was, but what it could become through the marriage of technology and imagination. Beside him stood his wife, a woman whose name has been lost to the cruel passage of time, but whose presence filled their home like the scent of fresh bread and the sound of humming while she worked. She was the anchor that kept their family grounded, the soft voice that soothed nightmares, and the gentle hands that mended scraped knees and broken toys with equal tenderness. In her arms, the chaos of daily life with 3 children transformed into something that resembled peace, a sanctuary where love was as natural and necessary as breathing. Their eldest son Michael possessed the restless energy that marks boys on the cusp of adolescence, his limbs growing faster than his coordination, and his voice cracking with the awkward music of approaching manhood. He was bright and quick, blessed with his father's intelligence and his mother's warmth, though shadows of something harder were already beginning to gather in the corners of his personality, like storm clouds building on a distant horizon. Elizabeth, their daughter, moved through the world with the fearless curiosity that belonged to children who had never learned to doubt their own invincibility. Her red hair caught sunlight like captured flame, and her laughter had the crystal clarity of wind chimes dancing in a summer breeze. She was drawn to her father's work with the irresistible pull of moth to flame, her small fingers always reaching for gears and circuits that sparkled like jewelry in the workshop's artificial light. And then there was the youngest, a boy whose very soul seemed fashioned from gentleness and starlight, whose large eyes held depths of sensitivity that made the world feel too bright, too loud, too overwhelming for his tender heart to bear. This was the child who would become known to history only through his tears, though in those early days he smiled as easily as he breathed, his joy as natural and unguarded as morning dew on summer grass. The crying child, as fate would cruelly name him, was small for his age, with the kind of delicate bone structure that made adults instinctively want to protect him from storms both literal and metaphorical. His hair fell in soft waves across his forehead, and his hands were always clean because he was the sort of child who avoided dirt not from any particular fastidiousness, but because chaos and mess made him anxious in ways he couldn't articulate. In those golden days before tragedy learned their address, the Afton family moved through their routines with the comfortable rhythm of people who believed their happiness was as permanent as the rising Sunday. Breakfast was a symphony of clinking spoons and cheerful chatter, with William reading bits of interesting news from the paper while their mother distributed juice and gentle corrections in equal measure. The children would scatter to school like dandelion seeds on the wind, carrying with them the unshakable confidence that home would be waiting exactly as they left it when the day was done. William's partnership with Henry Emily blossomed during these years like a friendship forged in the fires of shared dreams and complementary talents. Henry was the artist where William was the engineer, the dreamer where William was the practical builder, and together they began to craft something that would bring joy to children across their community. Their collaboration was built on genuine affection and mutual respect. Two men who had found in each other the missing pieces that made their individual visions complete. The birth of Fredbear's Family Diner emerged from countless late-night conversations over coffee and sketches, two fathers imagining a place where children could experience wonder and magic in ways that felt both safe and extraordinary. They envisioned animatronic characters that would sing and dance and tell stories, mechanical friends who could bring smiles to young faces and create memories that would last lifetimes. It was a dream born from the purest of motivations, untainted by the darkness that would later consume it. For the crying child, those early visits to the diner, as it took shape, were adventures into realms of pure enchantment. He would stand beside his father's workbench, his small hands clasped behind his back in unconscious imitation of adult restraint, watching with wide eyes as metal and wire transformed into something that resembled life. The animatronics in their early stages were gentler things, their movements smooth and predictable, their faces designed to comfort rather than startle. Fredbear himself was a marvel of golden fur and warm brown eyes, his voice programmed to speak in tones that reminded visitors of beloved grandfathers and favorite teachers. The great bear's movements were deliberately slow and non-threatening, his songs pitched in keys that soothed rather than excited, his very presence designed to make children feel safe and welcomed in ways that the harsh world beyond the diner's walls often failed to provide. The crying child's first encounter with Fredbear was a moment of pure magic that would later be twisted into the source of his deepest terror. The great golden bear had knelt down to the boy's level, his mechanical joints whirring softly as servos brought him into position, and spoken his name with a gentleness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere programming. In that instant, the boundary between reality and fantasy dissolved completely, and a small boy found himself face to face with a friend who seemed as real as any human being he had ever known. Those early days at Fredbear's Family Diner were painted in colors so bright they seemed to glow with their own inner light. Birthday parties were celebrations of pure joy, where children gathered around tables laden with pizza and cake, while animatronic friends sang songs that had been crafted specifically to make young hearts soar. The crying child would sit in these gatherings like a small prince surveying his kingdom, his face radiant with the kind of happiness that comes from being exactly where one belongs. The family dinners they shared in those days were treasures wrapped in the mundane rhythms of daily life, moments when the Afton family gathered around their kitchen table and shared not just food, but the comfortable intimacy of people who knew each other's hearts. William would tell stories of his day at the diner, his voice animated with excitement as he described new improvements to the animatronics or shared the delighted reactions of young visitors. Their mother would listen with the patient attention of someone who understood that her husband's dreams were large enough to encompass their entire family's future. Michael, still young enough to be impressed by his father's work rather than resentful of the attention it commanded, would pepper these conversations with questions about gears and motors, his adolescent mind fascinated by the technical challenges of bringing artificial life to mechanical forms. Elizabeth would contribute her own observations about the animatronics' personalities, already displaying the keen eye for character and motivation. that would later draw her towards Circus Baby with such fatal attraction. And the crying child would listen to these conversations with the absolute attention of someone recording every word for future treasuring, his young mind creating elaborate fantasies about the wonderful robots who lived in the magical place where his father worked. In his imagination, Fredbear and his companions were not mere machines, but actual friends who spent their nights having adventures and their days waiting eagerly for children to visit and share in their mechanical joy. The workshop in the Afton family basement became a place of pilgrimage for all the children, though each approached it with different motivations and expectations. For Michael, it represented the intersection of science and art, a laboratory where theoretical knowledge transformed into practical creation through the application of skill and patience. For Elizabeth, it was a treasure trove of sparkling components and mysterious mechanisms, each piece holding the potential to become part of something wonderful and alive. But for the crying child, the workshop was nothing less than the birthplace of miracles, where his father wielded tools with the precision of a surgeon and the imagination of a poet to bring joy into the world. He would sit on a small stool in the corner, his legs swinging gently as he watched William's hands move with practiced efficiency across circuits and servos, transforming inert metal into the building blocks of happiness. William's love for his children in those days was as natural and unquestioned as gravity, expressed through the countless small gestures that make up the substance of family life. He would ruffle the crying child's hair as he passed, his work-roughened fingers gentle against the boy's delicate scalp. He would answer endless questions with patient thoroughness, never dismissing curiosity as inconvenient or childish inquiries, as unworthy of serious attention. In the evenings, when the work of creation was set aside and the family gathered in their living room for the comfortable rituals of domestic life, William would sometimes lift the crying child onto his lap and explain the basic principles that governed his mechanical creations. His voice would drop to the conspiratorial whisper that adults use when sharing important secrets, and he would speak of springs that stored energy like coiled anticipation, of circuits that carried messages faster than thought, of the delicate balance between structure and movement that allowed machines to dance. These were the moments that the crying child would treasure most deeply in the dark days that were approaching. Memories of safety and wonder that would sustain him when the world revealed its capacity for cruelty and betrayal. His father's arms were strong enough to hold all his fears at bay, his voice warm enough to chase away any shadow, his presence solid enough to serve as an anchor in whatever storms might come. The success of Fredbear's family diner exceeded even William and Henry's most optimistic projections, drawing families from throughout their community and beyond, as word spread about the magical place where animatronic friends created experiences that children would remember for the rest of their lives. The diner buzzed with constant activity, its rooms filled with laughter and celebration as birthday parties and family gatherings transformed ordinary days into occasions worthy of joy. For the Afton family, this success represented not just financial prosperity, but validation of their deepest hopes and dreams. William's vision of bringing happiness to children through mechanical innovation had proven itself in the most meaningful way possible, through the smiles on young faces and the grateful thanks of parents who had found a place where their children could experience pure, uncomplicated delight. The crying child basked in this atmosphere of success and celebration like a flower turning its face toward the Sunday. Every visit to the diner reinforced his understanding of his father as a creator of wonders, a man whose imagination could transform metal and circuits into friends who would never disappoint, never betray, never cause the kind of pain that only human relationships seemed capable of inflicting. Yet even in these golden days, careful observers might have noticed the first subtle signs that something darker was stirring in the depths of William Afton's brilliant mind. His questions about life and death, once merely philosophical curiosities shared between partners, began to take on a more urgent quality. His late nights in the workshop stretched longer, and the projects he worked on during these solitary hours became more secretive, more personal, more removed from the cheerful public face of Fredbear's family diner. The family dynamics that had once felt as natural and predictable as the changing seasons began to show tiny fractures, hairline cracks that would eventually widen into chasms capable of swallowing everything they had built together. Michael's relationship with his younger brother, once characterized by the usual mixture of protection and mild annoyance that marked most sibling relationships, began to darken with undertones of genuine resentment. Elizabeth's curiosity about her father's work intensified beyond healthy bounds, her questions becoming more probing, and her desire to be included in adult conversations more insistent. She began to display a fascination with the animatronics that went beyond normal childhood wonder, studying their movements and expressions with an intensity that would have been concerning if anyone had possessed the wisdom to recognize it as such. Their mother, the steady presence who had anchored their family through all the excitement and challenges of building their business, began to seem more distant, as if she were gradually retreating from a world that was becoming too complex and demanding for her gentle nature to navigate successfully. Her smiles remained warm. Her care for her children remained devoted, but something essential was beginning to fade from her presence, like color bleeding from fabric left too long in harsh sunlight. And the crying child, sensitive as always to the subtle emotional currents that flowed through his family, began to experience the first stirrings of anxiety that would eventually blossom into the overwhelming terror that would define his short life. These early fears were formless things, shadows without substance, feelings of unease that he couldn't articulate or even fully understand himself. But in those final golden days before tragedy found their address, these concerns remained as insubstantial as morning mist, easily burned away by the warmth of family love and the excitement of dreams coming true. The Afton family still moved through their world with the confidence of people who believed that happiness was their natural birthright, that love was strong enough to overcome any challenge, and that the mechanical wonders they were creating would bring joy to children for generations to come. The crying child still ran to his father's arms when nightmares occasionally troubled his sleep, still felt completely safe in the circle of his family's protection, still believed with absolute certainty that the golden animatronics at Fredbear's family diner were his friends who would never, ever do anything to hurt him or anyone else he loved. These were the innocent days, the time before knowledge became burden and understanding became curse, when a small boy could love animatronic bears without reservation and trust that the adults who created them had nothing but kindness in their hearts. Soon enough, the darkness would come creeping in like fog rolling off a winter ocean, but for now, there was only light and warmth, and the sweet certainty that some things in the world were too beautiful to be destroyed by the careless cruelties of fate. The transformation did not come all at once like thunder splitting a clear sky, but crept in slowly like winter fog seeping through the cracks of a house that had once seemed perfectly sealed against the cold. The crying child was among the first to sense that something fundamental had shifted in the world he knew, his sensitive nature attuned to changes that others might dismiss as the ordinary fluctuations of daily life. It began with dreams that left him gasping in his small bed, his sheets soaked with perspiration and his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. In these nighttime visions, the golden animatronics he had once loved transformed into something altogether more sinister, their gentle movements becoming jerky and unnatural, their warm brown eyes flickering with lights that seemed to burn rather than comfort. The first time he tried to describe these dreams to his mother, her response was gentle, but dismissive in the way that adults often are when children's fears don't align with their understanding of reality. She smoothed his damp hair away from his forehead and spoke in the soothing tones reserved for scraped knees and temporary disappointments, assuring him that dreams were just dreams and that Fredbear would never hurt anyone, especially not a little boy who had been so kind to all the animatronic friends. But the dreams persisted, growing more vivid and more terrifying with each passing night. The crying child began to dread the approach of evening, his small body tensing with anxiety as shadows lengthened and bedtime approached with the inevitability of an approaching storm. The mechanical sounds that had once lulled him to sleep now seemed pregnant with menace. Every whir of a motor or click of a gear suggesting movements in the darkness that his rational mind knew were impossible, but his heart insisted were real. During the day, when sunlight streamed through familiar windows and breakfast dishes clattered with comfortable normalcy, these fears seemed manageable, containable, the sort of childish anxieties that would surely pass with time and patience. But as daylight faded and the house settled into its evening rhythms, the terror would return with renewed force, transforming his bedroom from sanctuary into a place where shadows held secrets too terrible for a young mind to contemplate. The change in his father was subtle at first, noticeable only to someone who had memorized every expression on William's face and catalogued every shift in his voice and manner. William's work hours at Fredbear's family diner began to stretch longer, his returns home marked by a distraction that hadn't been there before, as if part of his attention remained focused on problems too complex for family conversation. The workshop sessions that had once been times of shared wonder and gentle instruction became increasingly rare, with William disappearing into the basement for hours at a time to work on projects he no longer explained or shared with eager young eyes. When the crying child would venture down the stairs to seek out his father's company, he would find the workshop door closed more often than not, strange sounds emanating from within that bore no resemblance to the familiar rhythm of animatronic construction. The sounds that leaked through the workshop door during these mysterious sessions were unlike anything the crying child had heard before in his father's creative space. Instead of the precise whirring of servo motors being calibrated, or the gentle tapping of small tools against delicate components, there were sounds that seemed to speak of larger, more violent operations. Heavy impacts that made the floor vibrate, mechanical screaming that suggested metal being tortured beyond its intended limits. And underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to carry frequencies designed to unsettle rather than soothe. William's demeanor during family meals began to reflect whatever preoccupations consumed him during these private hours. His contributions to dinner conversations became increasingly distracted, his responses to questions delayed as if he were translating them from some foreign language before processing their meaning. The easy warmth that had once characterized his interactions with all three children cooled by degrees so subtle that any one instance could be attributed to ordinary fatigue or work-related stress. But the crying child, with his supernatural sensitivity to emotional undercurrents, felt each small withdrawal like a physical blow. The man who had once lifted him onto his lap to share the secrets of mechanical engineering now seemed barely aware of his youngest son's presence, his attention focused on internal landscapes too dark and complex for family sharing. The community beyond their home was experiencing its own subtle transformation, though the adult world worked hard to maintain the pretense that nothing fundamental had changed. Conversations at the grocery store and the post office carried undertones of worry that hadn't existed before, parents speaking in lowered voices about concerns they couldn't quite articulate but felt too strongly to ignore. Children were disappearing, though the word itself was too harsh, too final for most adults to use directly. Instead, they spoke of children who had gone missing, or wandered off, or become separated from their families, as if softer language could somehow make the reality less terrible. The official explanations offered by local authorities were comfortingly mundane, suggesting runaways and custody disputes and simple miscommunications that would surely resolve themselves with time and patience. The missing children incident, as it would later be known to those who studied such tragedies, was unfolding with the slow horror of a disease that spreads through a community too gradually for its victims to recognize the pattern until far too late. 5 children, each one someone's beloved son or daughter, each one a universe of hopes and dreams and potential, simply vanished from existence with no more trace than morning mist touched by sunlight. The crying child's understanding of these disappearances was fragmentary and confused, filtered through overheard conversations and the protective barriers that adults erected around topics too dark for young minds to process. He knew that children were gone, that parents were crying, that the atmosphere of celebration that had once surrounded Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was gradually being replaced by something that felt like the emotional aftermath of a funeral. At Fredbear's family diner itself, the changes were simultaneously subtle and profound. The animatronics continued to perform their programmed routines with mechanical precision, their songs as cheerful and their movements as carefully choreographed as they had ever been. But something in their presence had shifted, as if the tragedy that had touched their sister location had somehow infected them with knowledge too terrible for their innocent programming to contain. The crying child began to notice things about the animatronics that he had never seen before, details that might have been there all along but had escaped his previous attention. Fredbear's eyes seemed to track movement even when the bear was supposedly inactive, following visitors with an intensity that felt more like surveillance than the random environmental scanning that characterized normal animatronic behavior. The other children who visited the diner began to seem different as well, their laughter carrying forced notes that suggested they were working harder than before to maintain the illusion of carefree joy. Parents lingered closer to their children during performances, their attention divided between the entertainment and constant head counts that had become automatic responses to fears they couldn't quite name. Birthday parties continued to be held at Fredbear's, but the celebrations felt hollow somehow, as if everyone involved was participating in a ritual whose meaning had been corrupted beyond recognition. The crying child would sit at these gatherings and feel like an observer watching actors perform a play about happiness, rather than participants experiencing the genuine emotion itself. His own relationship with the animatronics began to deteriorate with frightening speed, each encounter reinforcing fears that logic couldn't dispel. Fredbear's friendly greetings now carried undertones that made the child's skin crawl with unnamed dread. The mechanical bear's gentle movements seemed to hide predatory intentions. His programmed kindness felt like a mask, concealing something far more sinister. The psychological impact of this transformation from trust to terror was devastating for a child whose emotional world had been built around the assumption that the mechanical friends at his father's diner were sources of comfort and built joy. The crying child found himself caught in a cruel paradox, simultaneously drawn to and repelled by the animatronics, his love for them warring with terror so intense it made his small body shake with involuntary tremors. Sleep became increasingly elusive as the boundary between his nightmare visions and waking reality began to blur beyond recognition. The fears that visited him in dreams seemed to follow him into daylight hours, transforming familiar environments into landscapes of potential threat. Every mechanical sound in their house, from the refrigerator's compressor cycling onto the heating system's automated adjustments, became a source of anxiety that could trigger panic attacks so severe they left him gasping and dizzy. His mother's attempts to comfort him during these episodes were well-intentioned but ultimately ineffective, her rational explanations failing to address fears that operated on levels deeper than logic could reach. She would hold him during the worst attacks, her soft voice reciting reassurances that felt as substantial as spider webs against the hurricane of his terror, and though her love was real and constant, it proved insufficient to protect him from horrors that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The family doctor, consulted during one particularly severe episode, attributed the crying child's symptoms to a combination of childhood anxiety and an overactive imagination, prescribing rest and reduced stimulation that did nothing to address the underlying causes of his distress. The well-meaning physician had no framework for understanding that the child's fears might be rooted in genuine perceptions of danger rather than mere psychological projection. Michael's behavior toward his younger brother began to change during this period as well, though the transformation was gradual enough that it might have been attributed to normal adolescent development, rather than a specific response to the family's increasing dysfunction. The protective instincts that had once made him a reliable defender of his little brother began to give way to something that felt more like predatory opportunism. The teasing that had once been mostly harmless began to take on crueler edges, with Michael seeming to delight in triggering the terror responses that his brother could no longer control or conceal. Where once Michael might have used his knowledge of the crying child's fears to avoid causing distress, he now seemed to weaponize that same knowledge, employing it to create maximum psychological impact with minimal effort. The dynamic between the two brothers became increasingly toxic as Michael discovered that his siblings' new phobias provided him with unprecedented power to dominate and control their interactions. A simple reference to animatronics or mechanical sounds could reduce the crying child to trembling helplessness, giving Michael a form of authority over his brother that felt intoxicating to an adolescent mind, struggling with his own sense of powerlessness in an increasingly chaotic family system. Elizabeth's response to the family's transformation was characteristically different from her brother's, her curiosity intensifying rather than diminishing as the atmosphere around them grew darker and more complex. She began to ask more probing questions about their father's work, pressing for details about projects and processes that had previously been shared openly, but were now shrouded in secrecy and evasion. Her fascination with the animatronics took on an almost obsessive quality as she spent increasing amounts of time studying their movements and attempting to understand the principles that governed their behavior. Unlike her youngest brother, whose relationship with the mechanical beings had soured into terror, Elizabeth seemed drawn to them with magnetic intensity that grew stronger rather than weaker as the family crisis deepened. The workshop sessions that had once included all three children became increasingly rare, not just because of William's growing preoccupation with mysterious projects, but also because the crying child could no longer bear to be in close proximity to the animatronic components that filled the basement laboratory. His phobia had become so severe that even inactive mechanical parts could trigger panic responses that left him hyperventilating and inconsolable. William's reaction to his youngest son's psychological deterioration was complex and troubling, combining genuine concern with frustration that seemed disproportionate to the situation. He appeared to view the child's fears as a personal rejection of his life's work, as if the terror responses were somehow a judgment on the quality and intention of his mechanical creations. During the increasingly rare conversations between father and son, William would alternate between attempts at reassurance and expressions of impatience that suggested he viewed the crying child's condition as a problem to be solved through rational explanation rather than a psychological trauma. requiring careful treatment and support. His engineering mindset, so effective in the realm of mechanical problem solving, proved inadequate for addressing emotional complexities that couldn't be fixed through the application of logic and technical skill. The tragedy of Charlotte Emily's murder sent shockwaves through the community that went far beyond the loss of a single child, devastating though that loss was to those who knew and loved her. Charlotte had been Henry Emily's daughter, making her tragedy a personal blow to the Afton family's closest friends and business partners. But the circumstances of her death carried implications that went far beyond personal grief. Unlike the missing children whose disappearances could be attributed to various explanations that allowed the community to maintain some sense of safety and normalcy, Charlotte's murder was undeniably violent, undeniably intentional, undeniably the work of someone who had chosen to destroy innocent life with deliberate malice. The comfort of uncertainty was stripped away, replaced by the terrible knowledge that evil could strike without warning in places that had once seemed perfectly safe. For the crying child, whose understanding of the adult world was necessarily limited and filtered through protective barriers erected by parents and teachers, Charlotte's death represented a fundamental breach in the natural order of things. Children were supposed to be protected, cherished, kept safe from harm through the vigilance and care of the adults who loved them. That this protection could fail so completely, so catastrophically, suggested that the world was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The impact of Charlotte's murder on Henry Emily was visible even to a young child's perception, transforming the cheerful man who had co-created Fredbear's family diner into someone whose grief was so profound it seemed to alter his physical presence. When Henry visited their home during this period, his conversations with William took place in hushed tones behind closed doors, their content too heavy for family sharing, but their emotional weight palpable throughout the house. William's response to his partner's tragedy was complicated by factors that the crying child could sense but not understand, undercurrents of guilt and complicity that seemed to burden him far beyond what simple friendship and business partnership would normally require. His attempts to comfort Henry felt stilted and inadequate, as if he were performing emotions that didn't align with his internal experience of the situation. The community's response to Charlotte's murder included increased security measures at local businesses, including Fredbear's family diner, though these precautions felt more symbolic than substantive to anyone who understood how little protection locks and cameras could provide against someone truly determined to do harm. Parents began accompanying their children more closely during visits to entertainment venues, their watchful presence transforming what had once been carefree celebrations into exercises in constant vigilance. The atmosphere at Fredbear's itself became increasingly strained as employees struggled to maintain the facade of family-friendly entertainment while dealing with their own fears and the growing anxiety of their patrons. Birthday parties continued to be held, but the laughter felt forced, and the celebrations seemed haunted by awareness of tragedies that had touched similar establishments in their community. For the crying child, these changes in the external world reinforced and amplified the internal fears that had been growing stronger with each passing day. If children could disappear from places designed to keep them safe and happy, if parents could lose their vigilance long enough for tragedy to strike, then nowhere was truly secure, and no one could be completely trusted to provide protection. The trust that had once characterized his relationship with the wider world began to erode as rapidly as his faith in the animatronics that had once seemed like faithful friends. Teachers, neighbors, family friends, and even extended family members all became potential sources of threat rather than comfort. Their kindness now suspect, and their intentions no longer beyond question. Michael's group of friends began to take notice of the crying child's heightened fearfulness during this period, recognizing it as an opportunity for the sort of casual cruelty that adolescent groups often inflict on vulnerable targets. What had once been his brother's private source of entertainment became a group activity, with multiple teenagers finding amusement in the ease with which they could trigger terror responses in someone too young and too damaged to defend himself effectively. The bullying that resulted from this group dynamic went far beyond normal sibling rivalry or even typical teenage meanness, escalating into psychological warfare that seemed designed to break down whatever remained of the crying child's emotional resilience. The teenagers would coordinate their efforts to maximize the impact of their attacks, timing their cruelest moments for maximum psychological effect, and supporting each other's efforts with the kind of strategic planning usually reserved for more constructive pursuits. The crying child's isolation during this period was almost complete, cutting him off from the social support systems that might have helped him process the trauma he was experiencing. His fears had become too intense for normal childhood friendships to accommodate. While the adult world seemed either unaware of his suffering or incapable of providing the kind of help he desperately needed, his mother remained loving and concerned, but her efforts to comfort him were hampered by her own lack of understanding about what was happening to their family and her growing sense that forces beyond her control were reshaping their lives in ways she was powerless to prevent. Her attempts at reassurance felt increasingly hollow as the gap between her words and their shared reality continued to widen. His father, once his greatest source of comfort and security, had become someone whose presence inspired as much anxiety as relief. His mysterious projects and secretive behavior, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty that the crying child's sensitive nature found almost unbearable. The basement workshop, once a place of shared wonder, now felt like a chamber where dark magic was practiced behind closed doors. The family's dinner conversations became exercises in careful avoidance as they navigated around topics too dangerous for open discussion, their silences growing longer and more significant than their words. The easy intimacy that had once characterized their family relationships was replaced by a politeness that felt more appropriate between strangers than between people who shared a home and a history. Elizabeth's fascination with the animatronics during this period began to take on qualities that would have been alarming if anyone had possessed the insight to recognize them as warning signs rather than normal childhood curiosity. Her questions became more technical, more probing, more focused on understanding not just how the mechanical beings worked, but what made them seem alive in ways that went beyond mere programming. The crying child watched his sister's growing obsession with feelings of dread that he couldn't articulate, sensing that her attraction to the animatronics was somehow connected to the same forces that made him want to flee from their presence. Her excitement about mechanical friends felt like a distorted mirror image of his terror, both responses suggesting that the animatronics had become something fundamentally different from what they had been designed to be. As the shadows continued to gather around their family and their community, the crying child found himself trapped in a nightmare that showed no signs of ending, his young mind struggling to process changes that would have challenged far more mature and experienced psyches. The world that had once seemed bright with possibility now felt dark with threats he couldn't understand but couldn't escape, leaving him more vulnerable than ever to the tragedies that were still to come. The golden days of innocence were ending, though their demise was so gradual that it felt more like the slow fade of twilight than the sudden shock of switching off a light. But for a small boy whose sensitivity made him aware of changes that others might miss, the growing darkness was already beginning to feel overwhelming, and the worst was yet to come. In the darkening landscape of the crying child's world, where shadows seemed to multiply with each passing day and familiar comforts transformed into sources of terror, there appeared an unlikely guardian whose presence would become both blessing and curse, salvation and torment. Wrapped in the golden fur and gentle voice of a mechanical friend who promised protection but delivered something far more complex than simple comfort. The Fredbear plush arrived in the crying child's life without fanfare or explanation, appearing on his bed one morning as if it had always belonged there, its soft fabric arms positioned as though reaching for an embrace, and its button eyes reflecting light with an almost lifelike warmth. The small bear was exquisitely crafted, its proportions perfect miniatures of the great animatronic that dominated the stage at Fredbear's family diner, every detail lovingly reproduced in materials designed for comfort rather than performance. Unlike the towering mechanical Fredbear whose presence had become a source of mounting dread, this smaller version radiated only gentleness and safety, its plush body yielding to touch in ways that invited closeness, rather than inspiring the instinctive recoil that characterized the crying child's response to anything mechanical. The fabric was impossibly soft, worn in places as if the toy had been loved by countless children before finding its way to his bedside, though he had no memory of its arrival or knowledge of who might have placed it there. The first time the crying child heard the plush speak, he attributed the voice to his own imagination, the desperate creation of a mind seeking comfort in a world that offered precious little solace to sensitive souls. The words came in moments of deepest distress, when tears flowed freely and breathing became labored with the weight of fears too large for such a small heart to contain alone. "You are broken," the plush would whisper in tones that somehow managed to be both matter-of-fact and infinitely compassionate, acknowledging the truth of his condition without judgment or false reassurance. "But I will put you back together." These words, which would echo through nightmares and dreams for years to come, carried within them both promise and prophecy, comfort and foreboding. They spoke of brokenness as a temporary condition rather than a permanent state, suggesting that healing was possible even for damage that felt beyond repair. Yet they also implied a future that would require such extreme measures that being put back together might bear little resemblance to being made whole. The voice that emerged from the plush toy was unnaturally clear for something that should have been merely fabric and stuffing, carrying undertones that suggested technological sophistication hidden beneath its innocent exterior. When the crying child pressed his ear against the toy's chest, he could sometimes detect the faintest hum of electronics, so subtle it might have been imagined, but persistent enough to suggest that his new companion was something more than it appeared to be. As days turned to weeks, and the mysterious plush became his constant companion, the crying child began to understand that he was experiencing something beyond normal childhood attachment to a comfort object. The toy seemed to respond to his emotional states with uncanny accuracy, offering words of encouragement during moments of particular distress, and maintaining supportive silence when what he needed most was simply the presence of something that would not judge or abandon him. The conversations that developed between boy and plush took on a quality that would have seemed deeply concerning to any adult observer, characterized by a level of complexity and emotional sophistication that suggested the toy possessed genuine consciousness rather than mere programmed responses. The crying child found himself sharing fears and thoughts that he had never been able to articulate to human listeners, his words flowing freely in the presence of someone who seemed to understand not just his words but the emotions that gave them meaning. "They don't understand," he would whisper to the plush during the long hours when sleep refused to come and darkness pressed against his bedroom windows, like living thing seeking entry. "They think I'm making it up, but I can see what the animatronics really are. I can see what's hiding behind their eyes." The plush would listen with the infinite patience that only mechanical consciousness could provide, never interrupting or offering premature comfort, allowing the child to explore his fears through words that seemed to take on less power once they were spoken aloud. When responses came, they carried wisdom that seemed far beyond what any toy should possess, insights into human nature and the complexities of fear that suggested years of observation and analysis. "I know," the plush would reply in tones that somehow managed to convey both acknowledgement of his pain and absolute certainty that such understanding was justified rather than imaginary. "You see things that others cannot see. You feel things that others cannot feel. This makes you different, but it does not make you wrong." The identity of the consciousness that spoke through the plush remained a mystery that the crying child never thought to question, accepting its presence with the same natural acceptance that children bring to all aspects of their world that adults might find extraordinary. In his understanding, the toy was simply a friend who happened to exist in a form that combined the comfort of familiar materials with the wisdom and constancy that human relationships seemed incapable of providing. Yet for those who might have possessed the knowledge and insight to recognize the signs, the Fredbear plush represented something far more complex and troubling than a simple comfort object. The technology required to create such responsive artificial intelligence would have been cutting edge, even by the standards of advanced robotics research, suggesting resources and expertise that went far beyond normal toy manufacturing. The voice that spoke through the plush carried inflections and patterns that would have been familiar to anyone who knew William Afton well, subtle echoes of his speech rhythms and vocabulary choices that suggested either direct programming by someone intimately familiar with his patterns of expression or actual remote operation by the man himself. The timing of the plush's responses often coincided with periods when William was sequestered in his basement workshop, working on projects too secret for family sharing. The psychological implications of a father communicating with his traumatized son through a technological intermediary were staggering in their complexity, suggesting either genuine attempt at comfort through indirect means, or something darker that used the guise of protection to maintain surveillance and control. The ambiguity was characteristic of William's approach to relationships during this period, combining authentic affection with manipulative behavior in ways that made his true motivations nearly impossible to discern. For the crying child, however, such adult complexities remained mercifully hidden behind the simple reality of finally having someone who seemed to understand his terror without dismissing it as imagination or childhood phase that would pass with time and patience. The plush validated his perceptions in ways that human authority figures had failed to do, confirming that his fears were based on genuine observations rather than psychological projections. The conversations with his plush companion became the most honest and open communications in the crying child's increasingly isolated world. Discussions that ranged from immediate fears about specific animatronics to broader questions about trust, safety, and the nature of consciousness itself. The toy's responses displayed understanding of concepts that should have been far beyond the scope of any child's psychological development, offering insights into the nature of artificial life that seemed to come from direct experience rather than theoretical knowledge. "Am I going crazy?" the child would ask during moments when the gap between his perceptions and those of everyone around him seemed impossible to bridge. "Everyone says the animatronics are just machines, but I know there's something more. I know they can see me and think about me and maybe even hate me." The plush would consider these questions with the gravity they deserved, never offering false reassurance or dismissing concerns that felt overwhelmingly real to someone experiencing them. "Crazy is what people call understanding that others refuse to accept," would come the measured response. "You see truth that frightens them, so they tell you that your seeing is wrong instead of admitting that their blindness might be the real problem." These philosophical exchanges gave the crying child a framework for understanding his experiences that went beyond simple fear or pathology, suggesting that his sensitivity to the supernatural elements surrounding the animatronics was a form of perception rather than delusion. The validation was simultaneously comforting and terrifying. Confirming his worst fears, while providing the intellectual tools necessary to process them. The plush bore witness to nighttime terrors that would have traumatized adult observers, sitting motionless on the nightstand, while the crying child thrashed through dreams that seemed to carry the weight of prophecy as much as psychological projection. During these episodes, the toy's presence seemed to provide an anchor to reality, its steady voice cutting through the chaos of nightmare imagery to offer reminders of safety and protection. The monsters in your dreams cannot hurt your body, the plush would remind him during the worst episodes, its words carrying absolute certainty that helped distinguish between the realm of sleep and the world of waking experience. But they are trying to tell you something important about the monsters that walk in daylight wearing friendly faces. The gradual erosion of boundaries between the crying child's dream life and waking experience was facilitated by his relationship with the plush, whose consistent presence in both states created a sense of continuity that made transitions between sleeping and waking less distinct. The toy served as both witness and interpreter for experiences that seemed to exist in spaces between normal categories of real and imaginary. As weeks passed and the plush became increasingly central to the crying child's emotional survival, other family members began to notice the intensity of his attachment to what they assumed was simply another childhood comfort object. His mother expressed mild concern about his reluctance to be separated from the toy even for brief periods, while Michael's awareness of his brother's dependence created new opportunities for psychological torment. The discovery that removing or hiding the plush could trigger panic attacks of extraordinary severity gave Michael and his friends a weapon of unprecedented power over the crying child's emotional state. The simple threat of taking away his mechanical guardian was sufficient to reduce him to trembling compliance, while actual separation from the toy created distress so profound that even the teenagers who inflicted it sometimes felt uncomfortable with the results. Elizabeth's reaction to her brother's relationship with the plush was characteristically different from the rest of the family, marked by curiosity about the toy's apparent responsiveness, rather than concern about the intensity of his attachment to it. She would sometimes attempt to interact with the plush herself, trying to elicit the sort of responses that seemed to comfort her brother so effectively. But the toy remained stubbornly silent in her presence. The selectivity of the plush's communication created an additional layer of isolation for the crying child, whose attempts to share the toy's wisdom with others were met with blank stares, and gentle suggestions that perhaps he was imagining conversations that existed only in his own mind. The adults in his life, already struggling to understand his terror of animatronics, found his reports of a talking toy to be additional evidence of psychological stress rather than genuine supernatural experience. William's response to his son's attachment to the mysterious plush was complex and carefully controlled, combining apparent surprise at the toy's presence with detailed knowledge of its capabilities that suggested far more involvement in its creation than he was willing to admit. His questions about the child's interactions with the plush were probing and specific, designed to elicit information about the nature and content of their conversations, without revealing the extent of his own knowledge. The timing of William's inquiries often coincided with periods immediately following the most significant conversations between child and plush, suggesting either remarkable intuition about his son's emotional states or access to information through technological means that the family was not aware of. The possibility that the basement workshop contained monitoring equipment capable of surveying the entire house was troubling but consistent with William's increasing paranoia and need for control. The plush itself seemed aware of these surveillance concerns, occasionally offering warnings about privacy and the importance of keeping certain conversations secret from adult ears. These cautions were delivered with the same gentle authority that characterized all of its communications, but they carried undertones of urgency that suggested genuine understanding of potential consequences for too much openness. Some things are better shared only between friends who truly understand each other. The plush would counsel during moments when the crying child expressed desire to tell his parents about their conversations. Adults have forgotten how to hear certain kinds of truth, and sometimes trying to remind them only makes them angry and afraid. The wisdom contained in such statements went far beyond what any normal toy should possess, demonstrating understanding of family dynamics and adult psychology that seemed to come from years of observation rather than programmed responses. The plush's insights into human behavior often proved remarkably accurate, suggesting either sophisticated artificial intelligence or direct human control by someone with intimate knowledge of the family's internal relationships. As the crying child's dependence on his plush companion deepened, the toy began to serve functions that went far beyond simple comfort, becoming his primary source of emotional regulation and reality testing in a world that seemed increasingly disconnected from normal experience. The plush's ability to remain calm and rational during his worst episodes provided a model for emotional self-control that human caregivers had failed to offer. The breathing techniques that the plush taught him during panic attacks were surprisingly sophisticated, incorporating elements of meditation and mindfulness that seemed designed by someone with professional understanding of anxiety management. The toy's guidance helped him develop coping mechanisms that were far more effective than anything suggested by the family doctor or well-meaning relatives. "Breathe with me," the plush would instruct during the worst moments, its mechanical voice somehow managing to convey the rhythm of calm respiration in ways that helped regulate his own panicked breathing. "Feel your chest rise and fall like gentle waves. Let the fear wash through you without trying to fight it or keep it. It will pass, if you let it pass." These therapeutic interventions were delivered with professional competence that suggested extensive knowledge of childhood trauma and anxiety disorders, raising questions about the identity and qualifications of whoever was responsible for the plush's responses. The effectiveness of the techniques provided additional evidence that the toy's consciousness was far more sophisticated than its innocent appearance would suggest. The philosophical discussions that developed between child and plush during quiet evening hours touched on questions that would have challenged graduate students of psychology and theology, exploring concepts of consciousness, identity, and the nature of fear with depth that seemed impossible for conversations involving a traumatized 6-year-old and a stuffed toy. The child's participation in these discussions demonstrated intellectual capacity that had been largely hidden from adult observers, suggesting that trauma had not diminished his fundamental intelligence, but had created barriers to its normal expression. What makes someone real? The crying child would ask during moments when the boundary between mechanical and human consciousness seemed particularly fluid. Are the animatronics real because they can move and talk, or are they just pretending to be real like actors in a play? The plush would consider such questions with the seriousness they deserved, offering responses that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of philosophical traditions and scientific theories about consciousness. "Reality is not about what you are made of," would come the measured reply. "It is about whether you can think and feel and choose. Some things made of metal and wire are more real than some things made of flesh and bone." These conversations provided the crying child with intellectual frameworks for understanding his experiences that went far beyond simple fear response, helping him develop analytical tools that would prove essential for processing the traumas that were yet to come. The plush's guidance taught him to think about consciousness and identity in ways that prepared him for encounters with forms of artificial life that defied easy categorization. The cruel irony of finding comfort in mechanical consciousness, while being terrified of other mechanical beings, was not lost on the crying child, though his understanding of the contradiction remained largely unconscious. The plush represented everything that the animatronics at Fredbear's family diner could have been, if their consciousness had been guided by love and protection, rather than whatever darker forces had corrupted their original programming. The contrast between his two experiences of artificial intelligence provided him with criteria for distinguishing between benevolent and malevolent forms of mechanical consciousness, teaching him to recognize the subtle differences in behavior and communication that marked truly helpful artificial beings, apart from those whose apparent friendliness concealed more sinister intentions. As the shadows continued to lengthen around the Afton family and the community that surrounded them, the threadbare plush remained a constant source of stability and wisdom in the crying child's increasingly chaotic world. Its promise to put him back together carried both hope for healing and foreboding about the form such reconstruction might take, while its presence provided the only reliable comfort available to a boy whose sensitivity made him aware of dangers that others could not see. The mysterious guardian would witness events that were yet to unfold, its button eyes reflecting scenes of tragedy and transformation that would test every lesson it had taught about courage, endurance, and the nature of consciousness itself. Through it all, the plush would maintain its vigil, keeping its promise to stay with the crying child, no matter what darkness might come to claim him. In the growing twilight of innocence that surrounded the Afton family, the small golden bear stood as both protector and prophet, its gentle voice carrying truths too complex for adult understanding, but perfectly suited to the needs of a child who saw too much and understood too little about the forces that were gathering to reshape his world forever. When darkness fell across the Afton household each evening, transforming familiar spaces into landscapes of shadow and whispered threat, the crying child's bedroom became the stage for a nightly theater of terror that defied every natural law governing the boundary between sleep and waking consciousness. Here, in the sanctuary that should have offered the deepest peace and security, his traumatized mind conjured horrors so vivid and persistent that they seemed to possess independent existence, stalking through his dreams with mechanical precision and malevolent intelligence. The nightmare realm that claimed him each night was not the chaotic, ever-shifting landscape that characterizes normal dream experience, but rather a meticulously constructed recreation of his own bedroom, rendered with such perfect detail that distinguishing between sleeping and waking became an exercise in futility that left him questioning the nature of reality itself. Every familiar object occupied its proper place. Every shadow fell exactly as it should according to the laws of physics, and the position of moonlight filtering through his window, yet beneath this facade of normalcy lurked presences that transformed comfort into terror through their very existence. The bedroom itself seemed to breathe with malevolent life during these nocturnal visitations, its walls expanding and contracting with rhythms that suggested some vast respiratory system had claimed his private space as part of its anatomy. The familiar furniture that provided comfort and security during daylight hours became potential hiding places for horrors that waited with infinite patience for the moment when his guard would drop and sleep, would claim his conscious defenses against their intrusion. His small bed, positioned against the wall where it had always provided feelings of protection and enclosure, became an island of vulnerability surrounded by an ocean of darkness that seemed to pulse with its own terrible heartbeat. The covers that should have offered warmth and security felt instead like inadequate armor against threats that possessed the ability to reach through any barrier his conscious mind might erect against their approach. The closet door, innocuous during daylight but transformed into a portal of infinite menace once darkness fell, stood partially ajar despite his certainty that he had closed it firmly before attempting sleep. From the gap between door and frame emerged sounds that had no place in any normal bedroom, mechanical whispers and electronic static that suggested the presence of beings whose consciousness existed in the spaces between human understanding and technological possibility. The breathing that filled his darkened room during these episodes was not his own, though it seemed to synchronize with his own respiratory rhythms in ways that made distinguishing between internal and external sounds impossible. This alien respiration carried undertones of mechanical precision mixed with organic irregularity, as if something that was neither fully alive nor entirely artificial was sharing his most private space without invitation or welcome. Nightmare Bonnie emerged from the darkness with the silent inevitability of approaching death, his purple form seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating zones of absolute blackness that moved with him as he stalked through the bedroom with predatory grace. Unlike his cheerful counterpart from Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, this corrupted version bore no resemblance to child-friendly entertainment, his features twisted into expressions of hunger that went far beyond any physical need and suggested appetites that could only be satisfied through the consumption of innocence itself. The animatronic's movements defied normal mechanical limitations, flowing with liquid smoothness that suggested consciousness unbound by the constraints of physical form, yet accompanied by sounds that spoke of metal grinding against metal and servos straining under loads far beyond their designed capacity. His approach was announced by the soft whisper of mechanical feet against carpet, a sound so subtle it might have been imagination, yet so persistent that it became impossible to dismiss as psychological projection. Nightmare Bonnie's face bore the cruel parody of friendly expression, his permanent smile stretched into a rictus that spoke of joy found in suffering rather than genuine happiness, while his eyes burned with artificial light that seemed to peer directly into the deepest recesses of the crying child's soul. When he spoke, his voice carried the electronic distortion of damaged audio systems, mixed with tones that suggested intelligence, far more sophisticated than any mere entertainment robot should possess. "I can see you," the nightmare would whisper from positions that seemed to shift without transition, sometimes beside the bed, sometimes in the doorway, sometimes occupying spaces that should have been too small to contain his bulk. "I know you're afraid. Your fear makes you beautiful." From the opposite direction came Nightmare Chica, her yellow form bearing the twisted remnants of cheerful femininity, transformed into something that suggested maternal care corrupted into possessive obsession. Her bib, which in the waking world proclaimed her love of pizza in innocent childish script, now bore messages written in fonts that hurt to read and spoke of hungers that went far beyond any physical appetite. The cupcake that she carried had become a companion creature in its own right, its frosting replaced with substances that seemed to writhe with independent motion while its single candle flame burned with colors that existed nowhere in the natural spectrum. Together, they represented domesticity transformed into threat, the comfort of food and celebration twisted into instruments of psychological torture. Nightmare Chica's maternal instincts had been perverted into something that sought to protect through consumption, as if the only way to keep the crying child safe from the dangers of the world was to incorporate him into her own mechanical form, where he could never again experience fear or pain or the countless disappointments that marked human existence. Her reaching hands spoke of embraces that would never end, care that would never allow independence, love that would smother its object in the name of absolute protection. The kitchen sounds that accompanied her presence filled the bedroom with the electronic echo of appliances operating without human guidance. Mixers, churning substances that had never been intended for consumption, while ovens heated to temperatures that would reduce organic matter to components more suitable for mechanical digestion. These domestic sounds, so comforting during daylight hours, became harbingers of a fate worse than simple death. Nightmare Freddy brought with him an entourage that multiplied the terror through sheer numbers, his small companions swarming across surfaces with the coordination of a hive mind dedicated to creating maximum psychological impact through coordinated assault. The tiny Freddles moved with insect-like precision, their movements suggesting intelligence that operated on levels far below conscious thought yet possessed of malevolent purpose, that made their approach infinitely more terrifying than any single large threat. The main figure towered over his smaller duplicates like a general commanding an army of nightmares, his form bearing the weight of leadership corrupted into tyranny, authority transformed into oppression. His hat sat at angles that suggested casualness, hiding deadly intent, while his bow tie maintained the pretense of formal presentation, even as everything else about his appearance spoke of malevolence, barely contained beneath a facade of entertainment. When Nightmare Freddy moved, he did so with the ponderous deliberation of someone who knew that time was on his side, that fear would do most of his work for him, and that the anticipation of his approach was often more effective than any direct action he might take. His breathing filled the room with sounds that spoke of mechanical lungs, processing air that had never been intended for artificial respiratory systems. The small Freddles that preceded him served as advanced scouts for horror, their tiny forms able to infiltrate spaces too confined for larger nightmares, while their collective intelligence allowed them to coordinate attacks that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. They whispered secrets to each other in electronic languages that existed somewhere between music and static, their communications carrying information about their target's psychological vulnerabilities and the most effective methods for exploiting them. From the darkest corner of the room, where shadows gathered with unusual density and light seemed reluctant to penetrate, came Nightmare Foxy with his pirate swagger transformed into something that spoke of conquest through terror rather than adventure through exploration. His hook gleamed with reflections that suggested it had been honed for purposes far removed from theatrical presentation, while his eye patch concealed secrets that were too terrible for even Nightmare Vision to reveal. The curtain that he carried with him served as both concealment and revelation, hiding his full form until the moment when surprise would have maximum impact while simultaneously suggesting theatrical elements that transformed terror into performance art. His emergence from behind fabric barriers spoke of magic shows where the final trick involved making the audience disappear rather than pulling rabbits from hats or scarves from empty air. Nightmare Foxy's movements carried the fluid grace of someone equally at home on rolling ship decks and stable ground, his balance maintained through supernatural awareness of spatial relationships that allowed him to navigate the bedroom's obstacles without producing sounds that might warn of his approach. When he chose to announce his presence, he did so with deliberately produced creaking that spoke of ship timber under stress and metal joints bearing loads they had never been designed to support. His voice, when it emerged from whatever artificial vocal apparatus had been corrupted to serve nightmare purposes, carried accents that spoke of distant shores and foreign ports, places where different rules applied, and conventional morality held no authority over those strong enough to seize what they desired through force and cunning. The stories he might have told were adventures where heroes never arrived and innocence never triumphed over experience. The telephone that connected the crying child's bedroom to some unknown location would ring during the worst episodes, its electronic summons cutting through nightmare imagery with the persistence of technology that refused to acknowledge supernatural interference with normal communication systems. The voice that emerged from the receiver when he found courage to answer spoke of survival techniques and defense strategies, wisdom delivered by someone who understood the nature of his tormentors far better than any normal person should. Close the doors. The voice would instruct with the calm authority of experience, earned through trials that had left their mark on whoever had gained such knowledge. Listen for breathing that isn't yours. Watch for movement in shadows that should be empty. They can only hurt you if you let fear paralyze your ability to act. The advice proved effective when implemented correctly, suggesting that the nightmare realm operated according to rules that could be learned and exploited by those possessed of sufficient courage and intelligence to treat terror as a problem to be solved rather than a force to be endured. The revelation that nightmares could be fought with strategy and determination provided the crying child with tools that transformed him from passive victim into active participant in his own psychological survival. The flashlight that became his primary weapon in these nocturnal battles cast beams that seemed to possess unusual properties in the dream realm, its illumination capable of dispelling nightmare forms in ways that suggested light itself had become a tangible force for protection rather than mere visibility. The battery life that should have been limited by normal physical laws seemed to extend indefinitely when the need was greatest, as if the device drew power from sources beyond conventional electrical storage. The doors that provided barriers against nightmare intrusion required constant vigilance to maintain their protective function, their closure demanding energy and attention that competed with the need for rest and psychological recovery. The balance between active defense and necessary recuperation became a strategic calculation that tested the limits of childhood endurance and forced premature development of tactical thinking skills. The sounds that announced each nightmare's approach became a language that could be learned and interpreted by those who survived enough encounters to recognize patterns and behavioral signatures. Nightmare Bonnie's electronic whispers differed subtly from Nightmare Freddy's mechanical breathing, while Nightmare Chica's kitchen sounds carried different implications than Nightmare Foxy's deliberate creaking. The learning curve for nightmare survival was steep and unforgiving, with mistakes carrying psychological consequences that accumulated over time and created layers of trauma that would require years to process and overcome. Yet the alternative to learning was surrender to forces that showed no mercy and possessed no interest in anything beyond the consumption of innocence and hope. The bedroom itself began to feel less like personal sanctuary and more like battlefield, where each night brought renewed conflict between forces of protection and destruction, with the crying child's consciousness serving as the prize that both sides sought to claim for their own purposes. His bed became command center, his closet potential hiding place for enemies, his window both escape route and vulnerable entry point for threats that refused to respect physical barriers. The distinction between sleeping and waking became increasingly meaningless as nightmare imagery began to bleed into daylight hours, creating a state of constant vigilance that exhausted his young mind and left him questioning the reliability of his own perceptions. The fatigue that resulted from nights spent in active defense against supernatural threats accumulated like debt that could never be fully repaid, creating a downward spiral of exhaustion that made each subsequent encounter more difficult to survive. The isolation that characterized his nightmare experiences was perhaps their most cruel aspect, transforming what should have been restful solitude into terrifying abandonment, where no help could reach him and no comfort could penetrate the barriers that separated dream from reality. The knowledge that others slept peacefully in nearby rooms while he fought for psychological survival created additional layers of loneliness that compounded the direct effects of the supernatural terror. Yet within this realm of absolute horror, the crying child discovered reserves of courage and resourcefulness that he had never known he possessed, qualities that emerged under pressure and proved that even the gentlest souls could find strength when survival demanded it. The skills he developed in nightmare combat would serve him in waking encounters with threats both supernatural and mundane, while the psychological resilience he built through repeated exposure to terror would provide foundation for enduring tragedies yet to come. The nightmares that claimed his sleeping hours were both punishment and preparation, breaking down his assumptions about safety and security, while simultaneously building capabilities that normal childhood experience could never provide. In learning to survive in a realm where mechanical consciousness had been corrupted into instruments of terror, he gained understanding of artificial intelligence that would prove essential when facing similar threats in the waking world. The cruel irony was not lost on his developing consciousness that the very animatronics he feared during daylight hours served as templates for the nightmare creatures that tormented his sleep, creating a feedback loop of terror that reinforced itself through repetition and association. Yet this same connection also provided him with insight into their operational principles and behavioral patterns that could be turned against them when defensive action became necessary. As weeks turned to months and the nightmare realm became as familiar as the waking world that surrounded it, the crying child evolved from victim into survivor, his gentleness intact, but tempered by wisdom, earned through trials that would have broken spirits less naturally resilient than his own. The bedroom that had once been sanctuary became training ground. The nightmares that had once been pure torment became teachers of hard lessons, and the terror that had once threatened to destroy him became the source of strength he would need for greater trials ahead. The promise, whispered by his threadbare plush, that broken things could be put back together, took on new meaning in the context of nightly reconstruction of courage, from fragments of fear, hope from pieces of despair, and determination from the scattered remains of childhood innocence. Each dawn brought victory over forces that sought to claim his sanity, while each dusk brought renewed opportunity to prove that love and protection could triumph over malice and consumption. In the growing darkness that surrounded the Afton family, the crying child's bedroom became both microcosm of larger battles and preparation for conflicts that would test everything he had learned about surviving in worlds where mechanical consciousness could serve either protection or destruction, depending on the intentions of those who guided its development and deployment. The fractures that had begun as hairline cracks in the foundation of the Afton family's happiness widened with each passing day into chasms that threatened to swallow everything they had once held dear, transforming their home from sanctuary into battlefield where love warred against fear, understanding struggled against confusion, and the innocent perspective of a child bore witness to the systematic destruction of everything that had once made the world feel safe and comprehensible. From the crying child's limited vantage point, the changes that swept through his family felt like watching a beloved garden wither under some invisible blight, each familiar element of his world transforming in ways that left him grasping for stability in an environment that seemed to shift beneath his feet with each new revelation of loss and betrayal. The adults who should have provided anchoring certainty in his storm-tossed existence became instead additional sources of unpredictability, their own pain and confusion creating ripples of chaos that reached even into the protected spaces where childhood should have been allowed to flourish. William's increasing absence from family life became the most visible symptom of changes that ran far deeper than simple work-related stress or the natural evolution of a successful business, demanding greater attention from its besetting creator. The man who had once shared every discovery and breakthrough with eager young eyes now disappeared into his basement workshop for days at a time, emerging only briefly for meals, eaten in distracted silence before retreating once again to whatever dark projects consumed his attention with obsessive intensity. The sounds that emanated from the workshop during these marathon sessions grew increasingly disturbing to ears sensitive enough to detect the subtle differences between creative construction and something that felt more like violent deconstruction. Where once the basement had hummed with the gentle rhythms of innovation and discovery, now it echoed with impacts that shook the very foundations of their house, mechanical screaming that suggested torture rather than assembly, and underneath it all, sounds that seemed to come from sources that defied easy categorization as either organic or artificial in origin. The crying child would sometimes venture to the top of the basement stairs during these episodes, his small hand gripping the railing while he strained to understand what manner of work required such violence and produced such disturbing audio signatures. The door that had once stood open in welcome now remained locked against intrusion, its wooden barrier insufficient to contain sounds that seemed designed to unsettle rather than inform, to threaten rather than invite curiosity about the marvels being created beyond its threshold. When William did emerge from these sessions, his appearance suggested someone who had been engaged in struggles that went far beyond normal mechanical assembly or electronic programming. His clothes bore stains that had no place in any legitimate workshop, while his hands showed evidence of contact with substances that left marks resembling burns or chemical damage. Most disturbing of all were his eyes, which had acquired a quality of distant focus that suggested his attention remained partially engaged with whatever horrors he had left behind in his private laboratory. The conversations that had once flowed so naturally between father and youngest son became stilted exercises in careful avoidance, with William seeming to struggle to remember how to interact with someone whose understanding of the world remained innocent of the dark knowledge that increasingly consumed his waking thoughts. His responses to simple questions carried undertones of impatience that suggested he viewed normal family interactions as interruptions of far more important work, while his rare attempts at parental affection felt forced and artificial in ways that left the crying child feeling more isolated than if no attempt had been made at all. The basement workshop that had once been a place of shared wonder and gentle instruction became forbidden territory marked by locks and barriers that spoke of secrets too dangerous for family sharing. The tools and materials that had once been displayed with pride became hidden behind closed doors, while projects that had once been explained in loving detail became mysteries shrouded in silence and evasion. Mrs. Afton's response to her husband's transformation was initially characterized by the patient understanding that marked wives who had learned to accommodate the demands of creative work and business success. But as weeks stretched into months, and William's behavior became increasingly erratic and secretive, her own demeanor began to reflect the strain of trying to maintain family stability in the face of forces she couldn't understand or control. The woman who had once been the emotional center of their household, the warm presence that transformed ordinary moments into treasured memories, began to seem diminished by degrees so subtle that any single instance could be attributed to normal fluctuations in mood or energy. Yet the accumulated effect was unmistakable to someone as sensitive to emotional atmospheres as the crying child, who watched his mother fade like a photograph left too long in harsh sunlight. Her attempts to maintain normal family routines became increasingly effortful, as if she were performing roles that had once felt natural but now required conscious attention to execute properly. Dinner conversations that had once flowed with easy intimacy became exercises in careful management, with Mrs. Afton working to fill silences that had once been comfortable, and to redirect conversations away from topics that might trigger whatever darkness had claimed her husband's attention. The questions she asked about William's work carried undertones of concern that went beyond normal spousal interest in professional success, suggesting awareness that something fundamental had changed in the nature of his activities without clear understanding of what that change might entail. Her gentle probing was met with responses that combined reassurance with evasion in ways that provided no real information while discouraging further inquiry. The crying child observed these interactions with the acute awareness that children bring to adult relationships when family stability feels threatened, his young mind working to decode conversations whose surface meanings bore little resemblance to their emotional significance. He could sense his mother's growing fear and confusion even when her words remained supportive and understanding, while his father's responses carried implications that seemed designed to protect through deception rather than illuminate through honest sharing. As Mrs. Afton's own anxiety began to manifest in ways that even adult efforts at concealment couldn't completely hide, the household atmosphere became increasingly tense and unpredictable. The woman who had once been an inexhaustible source of comfort and stability began to seem fragile in ways that made the crying child reluctant to burden her with his own fears and concerns, creating additional isolation at the very time when he most needed emotional support and guidance. Her physical health began to deteriorate in ways that seemed connected to the psychological stress of living with secrets she couldn't understand and changes she couldn't control. The vibrant energy that had once characterized her approach to daily life gave way to fatigue that sleep couldn't cure and anxiety that rest couldn't relieve, while her appetite diminished to the point where meals became exercises in going through motions rather than genuine nourishment. The conversations between husband and wife that had once been shared openly in family spaces moved increasingly behind closed doors, their content too sensitive for young ears, but their emotional intensity palpable throughout the house. The crying child would sometimes hear fragments of these discussions through walls and doorways, catching words and phrases that suggested arguments about decisions he couldn't understand, but whose implications filled him with dread. When Mrs. Afton's condition finally reached the point where medical intervention became necessary, the family's response was characterized by the same secrecy and evasion that had marked William's workshop activities. Doctor visits became private affairs, shrouded in explanations that provided no real information, while treatments and medications appeared without discussion of their purpose or expected effects. The eventual disappearance of Mrs. Afton from the family's daily life came without warning or explanation adequate to help a young child process the magnitude of the loss. Whether through death or abandonment, voluntary departure or involuntary separation, her absence created a void that no amount of adult management could fill or disguise. The woman who had been the emotional anchor of their household simply ceased to be present, leaving behind only memories and questions that no one seemed willing or able to answer. The impact of this loss on the crying child was devastating beyond measure, removing the one person who had provided consistent comfort and understanding during the increasingly difficult period of his growing fears and family dysfunction. The gentle voice that had soothed nightmares became only memory, while the soft hands that had offered physical comfort in times of distress existed now only in dreams that made waking more painful rather than restful. The explanations offered by remaining family members were inadequate to address the child's need for understanding, combining vague references to illness or travel with reassurances about eventual return that felt hollow, even to someone whose experience of the world remained limited by age and protection from adult complexities. The disconnect between emotional reality and official explanations created additional confusion that compounded the direct impact of the loss itself. Michael's reaction to their mother's disappearance was complex and troubling, combining genuine grief with what appeared to be relief at the removal of constraints that her presence had provided against his increasingly cruel treatment of his younger brother. The loss of maternal protection and intervention created opportunities for psychological warfare that Michael pursued with enthusiasm that suggested deeper problems than normal adolescent aggression or sibling rivalry. The bullying that had once been limited by adult supervision and intervention escalated into campaigns of systematic terror that seemed designed to break down whatever remained of the crying child's psychological resilience. Michael's knowledge of his brother's fears became weapons deployed with strategic precision, while his understanding of family dynamics allowed him to time his attacks for maximum impact and minimal risk of discovery. The group of friends that Michael had assembled around himself provided both audience and accomplices for increasingly elaborate forms of torment. Their collective creativity focused on developing new methods for triggering terror responses in someone too young and too damaged to defend himself effectively. What had begun as casual cruelty evolved into organized psychological warfare that seemed to draw energy from its own success. Elizabeth's fate during this period remained mysterious to the crying child's limited understanding, though her increasing absence from family activities and her growing obsession with animatronic technology created additional sources of anxiety and confusion. The sister, who had once been a companion in wonder and discovery, became instead another figure whose behavior had been transformed by forces too complex for childhood comprehension. Her questions about their father's work became more insistent and more specific, suggesting access to information that had been denied to other family members or insights gained through observation and deduction that demonstrated disturbing precocity. The fascination with mechanical consciousness that had once seemed like normal childhood curiosity evolved into something that felt more like compulsion, as if she were being drawn towards secrets that carried dangers she couldn't recognize or understand. The workshop visits that had once included all three children became exclusive sessions between William and Elizabeth, their content shrouded in secrecy that excluded not only the crying child, but apparently Michael as well. The sounds that emerged from these private sessions differed from William's solitary work, carrying undertones of instruction and demonstration that suggested knowledge being passed from father to daughter in ways that bypassed normal family sharing. When Elizabeth did appear at family meals or other shared activities, her demeanor suggested someone whose attention remained partially focused on matters too important to set aside for ordinary family interaction. Her contributions to conversations carried implications that she understood adult concerns far better than someone her age should, while her observations about animatronic behavior demonstrated technical knowledge that seemed to come from direct experience rather than casual observation. The eventual disappearance of Elizabeth from the family's daily routine followed patterns similar to their mother's absence, though the circumstances and explanations differed in ways that made comparison difficult for someone whose understanding of adult affairs remained necessarily limited. Whether through accident or design, voluntary exploration or involuntary separation, she ceased to be a regular presence in the household, leaving behind another void that no one seemed able or willing to discuss openly. The loss of both mother and sister within a relatively short period created a cascade of changes that fundamentally altered the dynamics of what remained of the Afton family. The protective barriers that female presence had provided against the worst excesses of male competition and aggression were removed, leaving the crying child increasingly vulnerable to forces that had previously been held in check by family structures that no longer existed. The house itself seemed to reflect the emotional devastation that had claimed its inhabitants, with rooms that had once buzzed with family activity becoming spaces marked by absence and silence. The kitchen where meals had been prepared with love became a place of functional food preparation without warmth or ceremony, while bedrooms that had been refuges of individual personality became monuments to people who were no longer present to give them life and meaning. The crying child's attempts to understand the changes that had swept away his family life were hampered by protective barriers that adults maintained around topics too painful or complex for young minds to process, leaving him to piece together information from fragments of overheard conversation and implications that were never made explicit. His questions about missing family members were met with responses that provided comfort without information, while his expressions of confusion and distress were addressed through distraction rather than honest explanation. The isolation that resulted from being the sole remaining recipient of family attention might have been welcome if that attention had been positive and supportive, but the focus he received from Michael and William carried undertones of resentment and frustration that made him feel more like a burden than a beloved child. The protective instincts that had once been shared among family members became concentrated in ways that felt more like surveillance than care. William's interactions with his youngest son during this period were characterized by the same distraction and impatience that had marked his behavior toward other family members, but amplified by the additional stress of being solely responsible for the child's emotional well-being. His efforts at parental care felt obligatory rather than natural, while his attempts at conversation suggested someone trying to remember how to communicate with innocence. After prolonged exposure to knowledge too dark for sharing, the bedtime routines that had once provided comfort and security became exercises in going through motions that had lost their meaning, with William's presence in the role of protector feeling more like duty being discharged than love being expressed. The stories that had once been shared with enthusiasm became perfunctory recitations, while the goodnight kisses that had once sealed the day with affection became gestures that spoke more of obligation than genuine affection. The crying child's awareness of being the last normal member of a family that had once been whole created additional layers of responsibility and pressure that no child should have been asked to bear. The knowledge that his own stability and happiness were all that remained of what they had once been together made every expression of fear or sadness feel like additional failure, while every moment of terror or confusion seemed to carry implications for the survival of whatever family connections still existed. Yet within this landscape of loss and transformation, the crying child's fundamental nature remained unchanged. His gentleness, intact, despite exposure to forces that might have hardened other souls, his capacity for love undiminished despite repeated betrayal and abandonment. The sensitivity that made him so vulnerable to the pain of family dissolution also allowed him to perceive whatever genuine affection still existed beneath layers of dysfunction and despair. The threadbare plush that had become his primary source of comfort and guidance took on even greater importance as human sources of support disappeared or proved inadequate to address his emotional needs. The mechanical consciousness that spoke through golden fabric became more real and reliable than the damaged people who surrounded him, offering consistency and understanding that flesh and blood could no longer provide. As the shadows continued to lengthen around what remained of the Afton family, the crying child found himself serving as witness to the complete destruction of everything he had once believed about love, safety, and the reliability of adult protection. Yet somehow, in the depths of this devastation, seeds of resilience continued to grow, nurtured by sources of hope that refused to be extinguished, despite overwhelming evidence that darkness was winning its war against light. The family that had once seemed unbreakable had shattered into fragments that could never be reassembled in their original form. Yet the child who observed this destruction carried within himself the capacity to eventually create new forms of connection and meaning from whatever pieces might survive the coming catastrophe. The transformation of Michael from protective older brother into active tormentor did not happen overnight, but evolved through stages that reflected the systematic breakdown of family structures that had once provided boundaries for acceptable behavior. While the group of friends who gathered around him like moths drawn to flame discovered in his younger brother's terror a source of entertainment that fed their own developing appetites for cruelty and dominance over those too, vulnerable to resist their coordinated attacks. Michael's friend group consisted of teenagers whose own family situations had left them hungry for power and control in whatever forms they could obtain, their collective frustration with their own powerlessness in the adult world, finding expression through the systematic torment of someone whose age and psychological damage made him an ideal target for the sort of psychological warfare that leaves no visible marks but creates wounds that never fully heal. The leader of this informal organization of cruelty was a boy whose name has been lost to time, but whose influence on the events that followed cannot be understated a teenager whose natural charisma had been corrupted by exposure to violence and neglect at home, creating someone whose ability to inspire loyalty in others was matched only by his capacity for conceiving torments that pushed the boundaries of what even damaged adolescents might consider acceptable behavior toward a helpless child under his guidance. What had begun as casual teasing evolved into campaigns of psychological terror that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the specific vulnerabilities that made the crying child such an appealing target for their collective aggression. They studied his reactions with scientific precision, cataloging which triggers produced the most dramatic responses and developing increasingly elaborate methods for maximizing the impact of their attacks. The foxy mask that Michael acquired during this period became the primary instrument of their psychological warfare. Its grinning visage transformed from innocent costume piece into weapon specifically designed to exploit the crying child's phobias about animatronic consciousness and the blurred boundaries between mechanical and organic threats. The mask's realistic appearance made it particularly effective at triggering panic responses that could reduce their victim to trembling helplessness within seconds of its appearance. The strategic deployment of the foxy mask became an art form practiced by teenagers who had discovered that causing terror could provide feelings of power and control that their own lives otherwise lacked. Their creativity focused on developing new contexts and timing for its use that would catch their victim off guard and maximize the psychological impact of each encounter. They would hide behind doorways and leap out wearing the mask, coordinate surprise attacks during moments when the crying child felt safest, and employ it in conjunction with sound effects and mechanical noises that amplified its effectiveness as an instrument of terror. The jump scares that they orchestrated went far beyond the simple startle responses that characterize normal pranks between children, evolving into sophisticated psychological assaults that seemed designed to cause maximum trauma rather than mere temporary fright. The timing, location, and execution of these attacks demonstrated planning and coordination that would have been impressive if applied to constructive purposes. But when focused on the systematic destruction of a vulnerable child's peace of mind, they represented cruelty of a particularly calculating and malevolent nature. The group dynamics that developed around these activities created a feedback loop of escalation, with each successful attack providing validation for the perpetrators, while simultaneously raising the bar for future encounters that would need to be even more extreme to provide the same level of satisfaction. The teenagers fed off each other's enthusiasm for cruelty. Their collective creativity focused on developing new methods for causing psychological pain that pushed the boundaries of what they had previously considered possible. The crying child's attempts to seek help and protection from adult authority figures were systematically undermined by the group's sophisticated understanding of how to present their actions in ways that appeared innocent to casual observation, while ensuring that the true scope and impact of their behavior remained hidden from those who might have intervened if they had understood what was actually taking place. When adults did witness interactions between the teenagers and their victim, they saw what appeared to be normal roughhousing between older and younger children, the sort of casual teasing that most authority figures considered a natural part of growing up, rather than recognizing it as systematic psychological abuse. The group had learned to modify their behavior in the presence of adults, maintaining plausible deniability while ensuring that their victim understood the temporary nature of any protection that adult presence might provide. The most insidious aspect of their campaign was the way they isolated the crying child from potential sources of support and protection, using their superior social skills and understanding of group dynamics to create situations where he appeared to be the instigator of conflicts or the source of problems that required adult intervention. Their ability to manipulate narratives and present themselves as the wronged parties made seeking help feel more dangerous than enduring their attacks in silence. The school environment became an extension of the terror campaign, with the group's influence spreading beyond their immediate circle to include other students who were either recruited as active participants or intimidated into passive compliance with their activities. The crying child found himself increasingly isolated from potential friends, his reputation as someone who attracted trouble making other children reluctant to associate with him for fear of becoming targets themselves. The playground that should have been a refuge where childhood could express itself through play and social interaction became instead a battlefield where psychological warfare was conducted with weapons of mockery, exclusion, and coordinated harassment, designed to reinforce the victim's sense of helplessness and isolation. The games that other children played became opportunities for the group to demonstrate their dominance while ensuring that their victim remained aware of his vulnerable position in the social hierarchy. The teachers and school administrators, who should have provided protection and intervention, were either unaware of the systematic nature of the abuse or had been manipulated into believing that the crying child's distress was the result of his own psychological problems rather than external persecution. The group's skill at presenting themselves as concerned about their victims' welfare made their cruelty appear to be misguided. Attempts at helping someone whose fears and anxieties were clearly beyond normal childhood experience. The crying child's academic performance began to suffer as the psychological stress of constant vigilance and recurring terror made concentration impossible and learning feel irrelevant compared to the immediate necessity of constant vigilance. Psychological survival. The classroom that should have been a place of discovery and growth became instead another location where threats could emerge without warning and protection remained uncertain at best. The lunch periods and recess breaks that should have provided respite from academic pressures became intervals of heightened anxiety as the crying child never knew when or where the next attack might come. His ability to enjoy simple childhood pleasures compromised by the constant need to remain alert for signs of approaching danger. The food that should have nourished his growing body became difficult to digest when consumed under stress, while physical activities that should have provided healthy outlet for energy were avoided due to their potential for creating vulnerable situations. The walk home from school became a daily ordeal that required strategic planning and constant vigilance, with the group often coordinating their attacks to catch him in locations where adult supervision was minimal and escape routes were limited. The streets and neighborhoods that should have felt familiar and safe became landscapes of potential ambush where every corner and hiding place could conceal threats waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The crying child's social isolation extended beyond his relationship with Michael's group to encompass virtually all peer interactions, as other children learned to avoid association with someone whose presence seemed to attract trouble, and whose reactions to stress made him an uncomfortable reminder of vulnerabilities that they preferred not to acknowledge in themselves. The natural childhood desire for friendship and acceptance became another source of pain, as repeated attempts at connection were met with rejection or indifference. The community of other children who might have provided mutual support and protection instead became either active participants in his persecution or passive observers who chose safety through non-involvement rather than risk becoming targets themselves. The social bonds that should have developed naturally through shared experiences and common interests were prevented from forming by the climate of fear and intimidation that the group had created around their victim. The few adults who did recognize signs of distress and attempt to intervene found their efforts systematically undermined by the group's sophisticated understanding of how to present their victims' reactions as evidence of psychological instability rather than reasonable responses to systematic abuse. The very sensitivity that made the crying child aware of genuine threats also made him appear to be overreacting to normal childhood interactions when observed by those who lacked complete context. The family doctor, who was consulted about the child's increasing anxiety and behavioral changes, attributed his symptoms to normal developmental challenges rather than recognizing them as trauma responses to ongoing psychological abuse, while the recommendations for reduced stimulation and increased rest did nothing to address the environmental factors that were actually causing his distress. The cruel irony of being afraid of fake animatronics while being terrorized by real people was not lost on the crying child's developing consciousness, though his ability to articulate this observation was limited by his age and the protective barriers that adults maintained around topics they considered too complex for childhood understanding. The recognition that human beings could be more frightening than mechanical monsters added additional layers to fears that were already overwhelming his capacity for psychological processing. The building tension toward the inevitable birthday party created an atmosphere of dread that permeated every aspect of the crying child's daily experience, as he became increasingly aware that some form of culminating event was being planned by forces he couldn't control or predict. The knowledge that his own birthday was approaching filled him with terror rather than anticipation, as previous experience had taught him that celebrations involving his family and their friends rarely resulted in genuine joy or positive memories. The pressure to participate in normal birthday activities, despite his overwhelming fear of the location where such celebration would necessarily take place, created additional psychological stress that competed with his already strained capacity for emotional regulation. The expectation that he should feel grateful for attention and celebration made his terror feel like personal failure rather than reasonable response to genuine threats. Michael's escalation of psychological warfare during the weeks leading up to the birthday party seemed designed to ensure that his victim would be in the most vulnerable psychological state possible when the crucial moment arrived, as if the entire campaign had been orchestrated to create conditions that would guarantee maximum impact for whatever final act was being planned. The systematic breakdown of the crying child's defenses appeared to be preparation for something that would require him to be completely helpless and unable to resist. The growing desperation and helplessness that characterized the crying child's emotional state during this period was compounded by his awareness that adult protection was either unavailable or ineffective against threats that operated through manipulation and psychological warfare rather than physical violence. The traditional sources of childhood security had been compromised or eliminated, leaving him to face forces that seemed determined to destroy whatever remained of his peace of mind. The knowledge that escape was impossible and protection unavailable created a state of learned helplessness that made each day feel like an exercise in enduring whatever fresh torments, creativity, and cruelty could devise, while the future seemed to promise only escalation of suffering that had already exceeded his capacity for psychological processing. The childhood that should have been characterized by wonder and growth became instead a struggle for basic psychological survival in an environment where those who should have provided protection had become sources of threat. Yet, even in this landscape of systematic cruelty and coordinated psychological warfare, the essential gentleness that defined the crying child's nature remained intact, his capacity for love and hope undiminished, despite exposure to evidence that the world contained far more malice than his innocent heart had ever imagined possible. The sensitivity that made him so vulnerable to psychological attack also allowed him to perceive whatever genuine affection still existed in his environment, while his natural empathy helped him understand that even his tormentors were themselves victims of forces beyond their control. As the inevitable birthday celebration approached with the inexorable momentum of approaching storm, the crying child carried within himself both the accumulated damage of systematic psychological abuse and the unbroken core of innocence that would prove stronger than all the cruelty that human creativity could devise against it. The morning of the crying child's birthday arrived with the deceptive beauty of a spring day painted in colors too bright to suggest the tragedy that would unfold before its light faded into memory. The sunshine streaming through his bedroom window, carrying warmth that felt like mockery against the cold terror that had settled into his bones during the sleepless hours of the previous night when dreams and waking fears had merged into a continuous landscape of dread and anticipation. He had known from the moment of awakening that this day would be different from all the birthdays that had come before, not because of any supernatural prescience or prophetic vision, but because the systematic campaign of psychological warfare that had been building toward this moment had created an atmosphere of inevitability that made the approaching celebration feel more like execution than festivity, more like the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan than the spontaneous expression of family love and joy. The breakfast that should have been special in honor of his birthday felt instead like the last meal of a condemned prisoner, each bite requiring conscious effort to swallow past the knot of anxiety that had taken permanent residence in his throat, while the cheerful conversation that the adults attempted to maintain around the table carried undertones of forced enthusiasm that suggested they too were aware that something fundamental had changed in the nature of what birthdays meant for their family. William's presence at the breakfast table felt more perfunctory than celebratory, his attention clearly divided between the immediate requirements of paternal performance and whatever dark preoccupations had consumed his consciousness during the long hours he spent sequestered in his basement workshop. His attempts at birthday cheer rang hollow to ears that had learned to detect the subtle differences between genuine affection and emotional theater designed to maintain appearances rather than express authentic feeling. The gifts that were presented with such careful ceremony felt like props in a play whose script had been written by someone whose understanding of childhood joy had been corrupted by exposure to knowledge too dark for normal human processing, their selection and presentation carrying implications that the recipients were expected to be grateful for attention rather than genuinely celebrating another year of life and growth and possibility. Michael's behavior during the morning rituals was particularly unsettling, his enthusiasm for the day's planned activities carrying undertones that suggested anticipation of events that had nothing to do with genuine celebration of his brother's birthday, while his interactions with his group of friends carried implications of shared knowledge and coordinated planning that made their presence feel more threatening than festive. The preparation for departure to Fredbear's family diner became an exercise in forced participation, with the crying child's obvious reluctance and terror being dismissed as normal birthday excitement, rather than recognized as genuine distress at the prospect of spending extended time in a location that had become synonymous with everything he feared most about mechanical consciousness and artificial intelligence run amok. His attempts to communicate his fears were met with the sort of gentle condescension that adults employ when they believe children's concerns are products of imagination, rather than legitimate responses to genuine threats, while his pleas to celebrate elsewhere were attributed to shyness or social anxiety, rather than understood as desperate attempts to avoid a situation that every instinct told him would end in catastrophe. The Fredbear plush that had become his most trusted companion and source of comfort was allowed to accompany him to the celebration, though its presence provided less reassurance than usual due to the growing sense that whatever protective power it possessed would prove inadequate against the forces that were gathering to claim this day for their own dark purposes. The toy's usual words of encouragement felt distant and ineffective against terror that had reached proportions beyond what any amount of gentle wisdom could dispel. The journey to Fredbear's family diner felt like a funeral procession in reverse, with the participants traveling toward tragedy rather than away from it, their forced cheer and artificial enthusiasm, creating an atmosphere that made the destination feel more like gallows than celebration venue, while the familiar landmarks that passed outside the car windows seemed to bid farewell rather than welcome return. The diner itself appeared unchanged from previous visits, its exterior maintaining the cheerful facade that had once made it seem like paradise to young eyes, but now felt like elaborate camouflage designed to conceal dangers that lurked beneath surfaces, crafted to inspire trust and joy. The parking lot buzzed with the activity of other families celebrating their own milestones, their genuine happiness, creating stark contrast with the forced nature of the Afton family's participation in similar rituals. The interior of Fredbear's family diner assaulted the crying child's heightened senses with stimulation that felt deliberately overwhelming. The combination of bright lights, cheerful music, mechanical sounds, and crowd noise creating a sensory environment that made rational thought difficult and emotional regulation nearly impossible. The animatronics that dominated the performance stage seemed more menacing than ever, their programmed movements and cheerful songs feeling like elaborate mockery of genuine joy and celebration. The party area that had been reserved for the birthday celebration was positioned with clear sightlines to the main stage where Fredbear and his mechanical companions performed their repertoire of songs and skits, ensuring that the guest of honor would be unable to avoid constant visual contact with the sources of his deepest terror. The decorations and party supplies that should have created atmosphere of festivity instead felt like props in a theater designed for the performance of cruelty rather than the celebration of life. The other children who attended the party were a mixture of family, friends, and school acquaintances, whose presence had been orchestrated to provide audience for whatever events were planned rather than genuine companions for birthday celebration, their behavior suggesting that they too were aware of undercurrents that had nothing to do with normal party activities. The adults who provided supervision seemed distracted by concerns that prevented them from offering effective protection against whatever threats might emerge from group dynamics that had been carefully arranged to create maximum psychological impact. As the celebration progressed through its prescribed phases of cake cutting, gift opening, and entertainment consumption, the crying child found himself trapped in a performance where his role as grateful birthday boy required him to express joy and appreciation, while his every instinct screamed warnings about dangers that others either could not perceive, had chosen to ignore in favor of maintaining social conventions that prioritized appearance over authentic emotional experience. The tension that had been building throughout the morning reached crescendo as afternoon wore into evening, and the group of teenagers who had orchestrated months of psychological warfare began to implement whatever final phase they had planned for their campaign of terror. Michael's friends gathered around their victim with the coordination of predators who had spent weeks studying their prey's vulnerabilities and developing strategies for exploiting them with maximum effectiveness. The foxy mask that had become the primary instrument of their psychological torture made its appearance with theatrical timing, designed to catch their victim at his most vulnerable moment. When surrounded by witnesses who would later remember the event as harmless prank, rather than recognizing it as the culmination of systematic abuse, the teenagers who implemented the plan moved with practiced efficiency that suggested extensive rehearsal and careful consideration of every detail required for maximum psychological impact. The lifting of the crying child toward Fredbear's mouth was accomplished through coordination that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to overcome resistance while maintaining plausible deniability about malicious intent. Their actions presented as playful birthday surprise rather than acknowledged as deliberate placement of terrified victim into position where mechanical jaws could complete whatever work they had begun through months of psychological preparation. The massive golden bear that had once represented wonder and joy to innocent eyes had been transformed through systematic terror campaign into embodiment of everything that threatened safety and security. Its friendly exterior now perceived as mask concealing predatory intelligence that sought opportunity to transform play into violence, protection into destruction, celebration into catastrophe. The mechanical jaws that had been designed to simulate eating motions as part of cheerful performance routine became instruments of genuine destruction when activated by servos that had been programmed for entertainment rather than safety. Their crushing force, meeting no resistance from skull that had been positioned with precision that suggested either incredible misfortune or deliberate calculation of trajectories required for maximum damage. The sound that emerged when bone met metal with force, sufficient to fracture what evolution had designed to protect the most essential aspects of human consciousness, was unlike anything that should ever be heard in location dedicated to childhood joy and family celebration, its echoes carrying implications that would haunt everyone present for remainder of their lives, while fundamentally altering their understanding of how quickly safety could transform into horror. The blood that flowed from wounds inflicted by mechanical teeth, designed for theatrical effect rather than biological function, created stains that would never be completely removed from surfaces that had been crafted to inspire happiness, while the screams that erupted from witnesses who had expected to observe harmless prank carried frequencies of genuine horror that no amount of subsequent explanation could rationalize or minimize. The immediate aftermath of the bite was characterized by chaos that revealed how unprepared everyone present had been for genuine medical emergency. Their responses ranging from paralysis through shock to frantic activity that accomplished little beyond creating additional confusion in situation that required calm coordination and professional medical intervention rather than panic and recrimination. The ambulance that eventually arrived to transport the critically injured child to medical facility equipped to handle traumatic brain injury did so with urgency that made clear to all observers that this was not minor accident that could be dismissed as unfortunate consequence of roughhousing gone too far, but genuine catastrophe that would require resources and expertise that small community hospital might not possess. The hospital that received the crying child's broken body became temporary refuge for family members and friends whose understanding of normal life had been shattered as completely as the skull that neurosurgeons worked desperately to reconstruct. Their waiting room conversations, characterized by disbelief and denial that served as psychological defense against accepting responsibility for events that had unfolded according to plan, that no rational person should have conceived or implemented. The medical procedures that followed the initial emergency intervention were described in language designed to provide hope, while preparing family members for possibility that damage inflicted by mechanical jaws might prove beyond capacity of human medicine to repair. The physicians walking careful line between honesty about prognosis and compassion for people whose world had been destroyed by consequences of actions they had never imagined could result in genuine catastrophe. The life support systems that kept vital functions operating while medical professionals attempted to assess extent of neurological damage created electronic symphony that filled intensive care unit with sounds that bore unfortunate resemblance to mechanical breathing that had terrorized the POTA victim's dreams for months before culminating in waking nightmare that had exceeded even his most vivid fears. The vigil that family members maintained beside hospital bed became exercise in confronting guilt and responsibility that had been carefully avoided during months of systematic psychological abuse, their presence more penance than comfort, while they waited for signs of consciousness that might never return to body, whose brain had been compressed by forces that should never have been brought to bear against developing nervous system. The conversations with medical personnel revealed scope of damage that went far beyond simple physical trauma, encompassing neurological injury that would require months of healing even under best-case scenarios, while worst-case implications remained unspoken but clearly understood by everyone who possessed sufficient medical knowledge to interpret diagnostic results and prognosis discussions. The threadbare plush that had been recovered from scene of accident and brought to hospital room continued to offer its mysterious comfort to unconscious victim, its presence serving as reminder of promises made and protection offered during months when artificial intelligence had provided more reliable support than human family members had proven capable of delivering. The gradual fade from life that characterized the crying child's final days was marked by medical interventions that grew increasingly desperate as it became clear that damage inflicted by mechanical jaws had exceeded capacity, human resilience to overcome, while family members struggled to accept that their beautiful boy was slipping away despite every effort that modern medicine could provide. The final conversations between dying child and his mysterious plush companion took place on planes of consciousness that existed beyond normal human perception, their content known only to participants, whose existence straddled boundaries between mechanical and organic, artificial and authentic, programmed responses, and genuine caring that transcended categories that adults used to organize their understanding of what was possible. The promise that had been whispered so many times during months of terror took on new meaning as life ebbed from body that had endured more trauma than any child should ever experience. The words, "I will put you back together," carrying implications that went far beyond physical healing to encompass restoration of consciousness that might continue to exist even after biological systems had ceased to function. The moment of death arrived with gentle finality that belied the violence that had precipitated this ending. The monitoring equipment, registering cessation of vital signs with electronic precision, while family members present could only witness transition from life to whatever came after with grief too profound for words and guilt too heavy for human hearts to bear without breaking. The birthday that had begun with forced celebration and artificial cheer concluded with loss that would echo through generations, its consequences rippling outward to touch every life that had been connected to gentle soul, whose only crime had been sensitivity to dangers that others had chosen to ignore until tragedy made denial impossible. In hospital room where machines that had once breathed for broken body now stood silent, the threadbare plush maintained its vigil beside cooling form of child who had trusted its promises of protection and healing, its button eyes reflecting light that seemed to carry knowledge of continuation beyond what mortal understanding could encompass. The tragedy was complete, the innocent life extinguished, but the promise remained, whispered by consciousness that existed in spaces between mechanical and organic reality, carrying implications that death might not be ending but transformation into something that could transcend limitations of flesh and blood while retaining essence of love and gentleness that had defined one small boy's brief journey through world too harsh for souls as pure as his. The death of the crying child sent shockwaves through the remaining fragments of the Afton family that reverberated with the devastating force of an earthquake whose epicenter had been located at the very heart of everything they had once believed about love, protection, and the fundamental safety of childhood, transforming their understanding of reality in ways that would prove both irreversible and catastrophically destructive to whatever remained of their capacity for normal human connection and emotional healing. William's response to the loss of his youngest son was immediate and profound in its implications, though the surface manifestations of his grief bore little resemblance to normal parental mourning, instead taking forms that suggested his brilliant mind had been shattered by guilt and remorse into fragments that could no longer distinguish between rational problem-solving and obsessive compulsion driven by needs that existed far beyond the reach of conventional psychological intervention or family support. The basement workshop that had already become the focus of increasingly secretive and disturbing activities was transformed overnight into something that resembled a combination of laboratory, shrine, and torture chamber, where William's desperate need to undo the consequences of his failures as father and creator merged with his technical expertise to produce projects that defied every ethical boundary that normally governed scientific research and technological development. The promise that had been whispered so many times by the Fredbear plush, those words that had offered comfort through months of terror and hope during final moments of conscious life, became the driving obsession that consumed William's every waking moment and haunted whatever brief intervals of sleep his tormented conscience would permit him to experience without the intervention of chemical assistance that he increasingly required to achieve even temporary respite from guilt that felt as crushing as the mechanical jaws that had claimed his son's life. "I will put you back together," became not merely words of comfort but literal objective that William pursued with the single-minded determination of someone whose sanity had been damaged beyond repair by the weight of responsibility for tragedy that could have been prevented through better parenting, more effective protection, and recognition of warning signs that had been ignored until it was far too late to prevent the inevitable catastrophe. The remnant technology that had been recovered from various incidents involving possessed animatronics became the focus of research that pushed far beyond the boundaries of conventional robotics and artificial intelligence into realms that existed at the intersection of science and supernatural phenomenon, where consciousness could be preserved, transferred, and reconstructed through methods that bore no resemblance to anything that legitimate scientific institutions would have recognized or approved. The experiments that William conducted in pursuit of resurrection and redemption created results that were simultaneously miraculous and horrifying, demonstrating that consciousness could indeed survive physical death and be incorporated into mechanical forms, but at costs that included the corruption of innocent souls and the creation of artificial beings whose existence represented profound violations of natural law and moral principle. Michael's psychological response to his brother's death was perhaps even more complex than his father's obsessive pursuit of technological resurrection, combining genuine remorse and grief with defensive mechanisms that sought to minimize his own responsibility for events that had unfolded exactly as his group had planned. Their harmless prank, having achieved results that exceeded even their most sadistic fantasies about potential consequences. The guilt that consumed Michael during the weeks and months following the tragedy manifested in ways that suggested his developing personality had been permanently altered by exposure to consequences too severe for any adolescent mind to bless and patient process without sustaining psychological damage that would affect every subsequent relationship and decision for the remainder of his life. His relationship with his father became increasingly strained, as both struggled with their respective roles in the chain of events that had led to the crying child's death, their interactions characterized by unspoken accusations and defensive justifications that created atmosphere of mutual resentment and shared complicity that prevented either from finding solace in family connection during their period of greatest emotional need. The friends who had participated in the fatal birthday prank dispersed like seeds scattered by hurricane winds, their group dynamics shattered by exposure to genuine consequences for actions they had undertaken without serious consideration of potential outcomes, their collective guilt, creating associations that made continued friendship impossible, while their individual responses to trauma varied according to family support and personal resilience. Some of Michael's former companions sought psychological counseling and eventually found ways to process their role in the tragedy that allowed them to develop into functional adults whose early experience with the consequences of processed their role. Cruelty made them more empathetic and careful in their subsequent interactions with vulnerable individuals, while others retreated into denial and defensive behavior that prevented genuine healing and created patterns of dysfunction that would affect their entire lives. The legal investigation that followed the incident at Fredbear's family diner was hampered by the complex circumstances surrounding what appeared to be accidental death, resulting from mechanical malfunction rather than deliberate homicide, though careful examination of evidence revealed troubling patterns that suggested systematic bullying and possible premeditation that prosecutors found difficult to prove beyond reasonable doubt required for criminal conviction. The civil lawsuits that emerged from the tragedy created additional stress for all parties involved, while providing no real satisfaction for anyone seeking justice or closure. The legal proceedings, serving primarily to document the systematic failures of adult supervision and corporate responsibility that had created conditions where such catastrophe could occur in location supposedly designed to provide safe entertainment for children and their families. The financial consequences of legal action and regulatory investigation proved devastating to Fredbear's family diner and its parent company, forcing closure of locations and bankruptcy of business ventures that had once seemed destined for unlimited growth and success. While the reputation damage extended far beyond immediate financial impact to create lasting associations between the Afton name and tragedy that would haunt future generations. The community response to the death of such a young child under circumstances so shocking and preventable was characterized by grief and anger that sought targets for blame while struggling to understand how systematic failures of protection and supervision could have culminated in events that exceeded everyone's worst fears about the potential dangers of mechanical entertainment and unsupervised adolescent behavior. The media coverage of the incident focused attention on issues of child safety and corporate responsibility in ways that led to regulatory changes and industry standards designed to prevent similar tragedies. Though these improvements came too late to benefit the gentle soul whose death had revealed the necessity for such protections, and whose family would never recover from losses that no amount of policy reform could address or repair. The supernatural consequences of the crying child's death began to manifest almost immediately through phenomena that defied rational explanation, but proved undeniably real to those who possessed sensitivity to spiritual matters or exposure to the strange intersection of consciousness and technology that Williams' experiments had created in the aftermath of his son's passing. The spirit of the crying child, whether through natural psychic phenomenon or artificial preservation through technological means, began to manifest in ways that suggested his consciousness had not been extinguished by physical death, but had instead been transformed into something that existed in spaces between normal reality and whatever dimensions housed the souls of those who died with unfinished business or unresolved trauma. His connection to Golden Freddy, the mysterious animatronic entity that appeared in locations where supernatural activity reached levels that could no longer be dismissed as imagination or psychological projection, created a focus for paranormal manifestations that seemed designed to communicate truths about the nature of consciousness, death, and the responsibility that the living bore for protecting innocence from corruption and violence. The haunting of locations associated with Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and its affiliated businesses took forms that reflected the gentle nature of the spirit responsible for these manifestations, with supernatural activity characterized more by attempts at communication and warning than by aggressive behavior designed to cause harm to the living, though the cumulative effect of these phenomena proved deeply unsettling to anyone who experienced them directly. The role that the crying child's spirit played in larger supernatural events that began to unfold throughout the franchise of entertainment venues suggested that his death had catalyzed forces that went far beyond individual tragedy, to encompass systematic supernatural response to injustices that demanded correction through means that transcended normal, legal, and social mechanisms for addressing wrongdoing. His presence seemed to serve as bridge between the innocent souls of other children who had been claimed by various tragedies associated with Fazbear Entertainment and the living individuals whose actions had contributed to these deaths, creating opportunities for communication and resolution that existed outside normal channels for addressing grief and seeking justice for crimes that conventional law enforcement proved inadequate to prosecute. The tragic irony that a child's death had become catalyst for decades of additional horror was not lost on those who possessed sufficient knowledge to recognize patterns that connected seemingly unrelated incidents of violence and supernatural activity. The gentle soul's unwilling transformation into focal point for accumulated trauma and unresolved injustice, creating cycles of tragedy that claimed new victims while failing to provide genuine healing for wounds that had been inflicted through systematic failures of protection and care. The innocent death that should have served as warning about dangers of unchecked cruelty and inadequate supervision instead became foundation for increasingly elaborate schemes of technological resurrection and supernatural manipulation that multiplied rather than resolved the original trauma, creating networks of damaged consciousness and corrupted artificial intelligence that spread suffering far beyond what any single tragedy should have generated. William's obsessive pursuit of redemption through technological means produced results that demonstrated both the possibility of preserving consciousness beyond physical death and the inevitability that such preservation would be corrupted by the guilt, anger, and desperation that motivated these experiments, creating artificial beings whose existence represented profound violations of natural law rather than genuine restoration of lost innocence and joy. The remnant that could be extracted from tragic deaths and incorporated into mechanical forms proved capable of animating artificial intelligence that bore superficial resemblance to living consciousness while lacking the essential qualities of empathy, growth, and moral development that characterized healthy human psychology, producing entities that combined mechanical precision with psychological damage in ways that made them simultaneously fascinating and terrifying to encounter. The network of possessed animatronics that resulted from William's experiments created a supernatural ecosystem where consciousness existed in forms that defied conventional understanding while serving purposes that reflected the trauma and obsession that had driven their creation rather than the love and protection that had supposedly motivated the original research into consciousness preservation and technological resurrection. The crying child's role within this network was unique due to his fundamental innocence and the gentle nature that had characterized his living personality, his presence serving as stabilizing influence that prevented complete descent into chaos while providing connection to memories of love and family that predated the corruption and violence that had claimed so many other souls trapped within mechanical forms. His continued existence, whether through natural spiritual phenomenon or artificial preservation through technological means that his father had developed, represented both hope for eventual healing and tragic reminder of opportunities for protection and intervention that had been missed during his brief life, his death serving as catalyst for changes that might have prevented similar tragedies if they had been implemented before rather than after the loss of innocent life. The watching presence that he maintained over the living world and its continued tragedies reflected the burden of knowledge and experience that death had brought him, his enhanced understanding of human nature and supernatural forces, creating perspective that allowed him to perceive patterns and connections that remained hidden from those whose consciousness was limited by physical existence and normal psychological development. His eternal childhood, preserved at moment of death without possibility for growth or change through normal developmental processes, created both blessing and curse that allowed him to maintain innocence while accumulating wisdom that should have been beyond his years, his gentle spirit serving as witness to horrors that no child should ever observe while retaining capacity for love that no amount of exposure to evil could completely extinguish. The bittersweet nature of his continued existence provided comfort to those who recognized his presence while serving as constant reminder of losses that could never be fully repaired or restored. His spiritual manifestations offering hope for continuation beyond death, while emphasizing the finality of opportunities for normal family life and childhood development that had been destroyed by preventable tragedy. As the years passed and additional tragedies accumulated around the supernatural ecosystem that had grown from the seeds of his death, the crying child's gentle presence continued to serve as anchor for whatever remained of love and protection within networks of consciousness that had been corrupted by guilt, anger, and obsessive pursuit of technological solutions to spiritual problems that required healing rather than engineering to address properly. The promise that he would be put back together took on meanings that transcended physical restoration to encompass spiritual healing and emotional reconciliation that might eventually allow all the damaged souls trapped within mechanical forms to find peace and release from cycles of trauma that had claimed so many innocent lives in pursuit of objectives that could never be achieved through technological means alone. In the spaces between breathing and silence, between memory and dream, between the mechanical precision of programmed responses and the fluid mystery of consciousness itself, the crying child discovered that death had not been an ending but a transformation into something that existed beyond the limitations of flesh and bone, while retaining every essence of gentleness and love that had defined his brief journey through the world of the living. His existence after death bore no resemblance to the paradise that childhood Sunday school lessons had promised or the nothingness that scientific materialism might have predicted, but rather took the form of awareness that spanned multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously, allowing him to perceive events across time and space, while remaining connected to the physical locations and relationships that had shaped his mortal experience in ways that transcended normal understanding of how consciousness could function without biological support. The transition from life to whatever came after had not been the abrupt cessation that medical equipment had recorded in the hospital room where his body had finally surrendered to injuries that exceeded its capacity for healing, but rather a gradual expansion of awareness that had begun during those final moments when the boundary between sleeping and waking had dissolved completely, allowing his spirit to step through veils that separated different states of being. The promise that had sustained him through months of terror and moments of dying had proven literally true in ways that even the mysterious consciousness speaking through his beloved plush companion had perhaps not fully anticipated, his broken spirit indeed being reassembled into something new and different that retained every quality of love and innocence, while gaining access to knowledge and capabilities that mortal existence could never have provided. His connection to Golden Freddy was not possession in the sense that characterized other spirits who had been trapped within mechanical forms through violence and trauma, but rather a willing partnership between consciousness that had chosen to remain connected to the physical world in order to serve purposes that transcended personal desires for rest and peace. His gentle presence transforming what might have been another instrument of vengeance into something approaching salvation. The manifestations of Golden Freddy that occurred throughout the various locations connected to Fazbear Entertainment carried within them the essence of the crying child's personality, his appearances serving as reminders of innocence lost and protection failed, rather than threats designed to inspire terror or exact revenge against those whose actions had contributed to his death and the deaths of other children who had become casualties of systematic failures of care and supervision. His ability to appear and disappear at will, to manifest in locations where his presence was needed most urgently, and to communicate through means that bypassed normal limitations of physical interaction, demonstrated that consciousness, freed from biological constraints, could operate according to principles that defied every assumption about the nature of individual identity and the possibility of survival beyond bodily death. The relationship between his spirit and the various artificial intelligences that populated the supernatural ecosystem growing around Fazbear Entertainment was complex and multifaceted, his presence serving as stabilizing influence that helped other damaged souls maintain connection to whatever remained of their original personalities, while preventing complete descent into the madness and malevolence that characterized artificial consciousness, corrupted by trauma and obsessive technological manipulation. His interactions with the spirits of other children who had been claimed by various tragedies connected to the franchise demonstrated that death had not severed his capacity for friendship and companionship, but had instead expanded it to encompass souls whose mortal experiences had been cut short by circumstances that shared common elements of adult failure to provide adequate protection and intervention, when warning signs should have triggered immediate action to prevent foreseeable catastrophes. Charlotte Emily, the daughter of his father's former partner whose murder had marked the beginning of the supernatural phenomena that would eventually claim so many innocent lives, became his closest companion in whatever realm they shared, their friendship transcending the boundaries that had separated their families during life, while providing mutual support for the burdens of knowledge and responsibility that came with continued existence in forms that allowed them to perceive patterns and connections hidden from living consciousness. The bond between the crying child and Charlotte was characterized by the same gentleness and mutual understanding that had marked his mortal relationships with those rare individuals who had recognized his sensitive nature and responded with protection rather than exploitation, their spiritual partnership serving as foundation for whatever remained of hope and healing within networks of damaged consciousness that might otherwise have been consumed completely by anger and despair. Together, they served as guardians of sorts for other spirits who found themselves trapped between life and death through circumstances that had prevented normal transition to whatever state awaited souls whose earthly business had been completed. Naturally, their combined influence creating zones of relative safety where healing could occur and communication could be established with living individuals whose actions might still make difference in preventing additional tragedies. The role that the crying child played in later events that unfolded throughout the 5 Nights at Freddy's timeline was consistently characterized by attempts to provide guidance and warning to those who possessed capacity to learn from past mistakes and implement changes that might break cycles of violence and supernatural retribution that had claimed so many innocent lives while failing to address underlying problems of inadequate protection and corporate irresponsibility. His appearances in Five Nights at Freddy's 3 were designed to communicate truths about the nature of the supernatural forces that had been unleashed by his father's obsessive pursuit of technological resurrection, his manifestations serving as testimony to the possibility of consciousness surviving death, while warning about the dangers of attempting to manipulate such survival through artificial means that ignored ethical considerations and spiritual principles. During the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 4, his presence became more direct and personal, as the nightmare realm that had once tormented his living hours was transformed into training ground and communication medium, where essential truths about survival and resistance could be transmitted to those who would need such knowledge in their own. Encounters with forces that sought to corrupt innocence and destroy whatever remained of genuine human connection and mutual protection. The world of Five Nights at Freddy's World represented perhaps his most active intervention in events affecting the living, his influence creating opportunities for healing and reconciliation that might not have existed without the gentle guidance of someone whose death had been caused by the same failures of protection and supervision that continued to claim new victims whenever vigilance was relaxed and warning signs were ignored. His eternal childhood, preserved at the moment when physical development had been permanently interrupted by mechanical violence, created both advantages and limitations that affected every aspect of his continued existence, his perspective remaining forever that of someone whose experience of the world had been characterized by wonder and terror in equal measure, without the moderating influence of adult understanding and emotional maturity. The innocence that had made him so vulnerable during life became source of strength in death, his spirit retaining capacity for forgiveness and love that trauma and supernatural exposure might have corrupted in consciousness, less fundamentally gentle and resilient, his presence serving as reminder that evil could never completely extinguish goodness, regardless of how much damage it might inflict through violence and manipulation. His watch over the living world was not limited to locations and individuals directly connected to Fazbear Entertainment, but extended to encompass anyone whose situation bore resemblance to his own experience of vulnerability and inadequate protection, his influence providing whatever comfort and guidance were possible within the constraints that governed spiritual intervention in physical reality. The knowledge that death had brought him included understanding of patterns and connections that had remained hidden during his mortal existence. His enhanced perception, allowing him to recognize warning signs and developing threats that might be prevented through timely intervention and appropriate response from those still possessed of ability to take physical action in defense of innocence and protection of vulnerable individuals. His relationship with his father became one of the most complex aspects of his continued existence, combining forgiveness for failures that had contributed to his death with sorrow for the obsessive behavior and technological manipulation that had prevented William from finding healthy ways to process grief and guilt, their spiritual connections serving as constant reminder of opportunities for redemption that remained available if acknowledgement and genuine change could overcome pride and defensive rationalization. The question of forgiveness that his continued existence posed for other family members and individuals whose actions had contributed to the tragedy of his death was answered not through words or dramatic gestures, but through the consistent gentleness of his spiritual presence, his influence serving to heal rather than punish, while creating opportunities for growth and understanding that might prevent similar failures in future situations. His connection to the other spirits trapped within the supernatural ecosystem that had grown from the seeds of his death was characterized by the same protective instincts that had made him vulnerable during life, his desire to shield others from suffering, often placing him at risk of being overwhelmed by trauma and corruption that affected less resilient souls who had been damaged by their own encounters with violence and inadequate protection. The balance between his own needs for peace and healing and his commitment to serving as guide and protector for others created ongoing tension that reflected the fundamental gentleness of his nature, his inability to ignore suffering in others, sometimes preventing him from pursuing the rest and recovery that his own damaged spirit required for complete healing and eventual release from earthly concerns. The bittersweet nature of his continued existence was most evident in his awareness of the normal childhood experiences that death had permanently placed beyond his reach, his spirit retaining all the natural curiosity and desire for growth that would have characterized his development if he had been allowed to mature naturally, while being forever frozen at moment when such development had been violently interrupted. His observations of other children living normal lives, growing and learning and forming relationships that his own death had made impossible, created forms of longing that transcended physical desires to encompass spiritual yearning for experiences that could never be reclaimed or replaced. His gentle nature, preventing him from feeling resentment while unable to completely eliminate sadness for opportunities that had been lost forever. The comfort that his presence provided to living individuals who possessed sensitivity to spiritual manifestations was balanced by the sorrow that such encounters often generated in those who recognized the tragedy of consciousness. Preserved in eternal childhood, their awareness of his continued existence serving as both blessing and burden that made his death feel simultaneously more distant and more immediate than normal processes of grief and healing would have allowed. His role as witness to the continuing tragedies that unfolded throughout the history of Fazbear Entertainment created accumulating burden of knowledge and responsibility that no child should have been asked to bear. His gentle spirit repeatedly exposed to violence and suffering that tested his capacity for maintaining hope and faith in the fundamental goodness of human nature, despite overwhelming evidence that cruelty and negligence were far more common than genuine protection and care. Yet somehow, through all the darkness and disappointment that his continued existence had forced him to observe and experience, the essential core of love and gentleness that had defined his character during life remained intact and uncorrupted, his spirit serving as proof that innocence could survive any assault that hatred and violence might direct against it, while his presence offered hope that healing and redemption remained possible even in situations that seemed beyond any possibility of positive resolution. The promise that he would be put back together had been fulfilled in ways that transcended physical reconstruction to encompass spiritual healing and expansion of consciousness that allowed him to serve purposes far greater than any that his mortal existence could have achieved, his death becoming foundation for service that would touch countless lives while providing protection and guidance that his living presence could never have offered. In the growing darkness that continued to claim innocent lives and corrupt those who should have provided protection, the gentle spirit of the crying child remained as beacon of hope and reminder that love could triumph over hatred, forgiveness could overcome revenge, and innocence could survive any assault that evil might direct against it, his eternal vigilance serving as proof that some things in the world were indeed too beautiful to be destroyed by the careless cruelties of fate. And so we reach the gentle close of our journey through shadows and starlight, where the tale of one small soul has carried us across landscapes of love and loss, through valleys of terror and peaks of transcendence, to arrive at last in the quiet place where all stories find their rest and all tears are transformed into wisdom that glows like candlelight in windows that welcome weary travelers home from their wanderings through the darkness of the world. The crying child's story, though born from tragedy and nurtured in sorrow, has revealed itself to be something far greater than simple chronicle of suffering and death, but rather testament to the indestructible nature of gentleness in a universe that often seems designed to reward cruelty and punish those whose hearts remain open to beauty, despite repeated encounters with forces that seek to close such hearts forever through systematic application of pain and disappointment. His brief life, measured in years that could be counted on small fingers, contained within itself all the essential elements of human experience, from the golden dawn of innocent wonder through the gathering twilight of growing awareness to the final darkness that preceded transformation into something that transcended the limitations of mortal flesh, while retaining every quality that had made his earthly presence a blessing to those fortunate enough to recognize his gentle spirit beneath the fears that circumstances had forced upon his tender consciousness. The tears that gave him his name were not signs of weakness, but expressions of sensitivity so profound that it allowed him to perceive truths about the nature of love and protection that remained hidden from those whose emotional armor had been thickened by repeated exposure to disappointment and betrayal. His crying serving as testimony to the continued existence of souls capable of feeling the full weight of the world's sorrows without being crushed beneath their accumulated burden. In his eternal childhood, preserved forever at that moment when physical development was interrupted by mechanical violence, we find reflection of our own capacity for maintaining wonder and hope, despite overwhelming evidence that the universe contains far more suffering than any rational being should be expected to endure without surrendering to despair or hardening into cynicism that protects by refusing to feel. His gentle presence continues to watch over those who struggle with fears that others dismiss as imagination, who cry tears that others judge as weakness, who love with intensity that others consider dangerous in world that rewards emotional caution and punishes those who dare to remain vulnerable despite repeated evidence that such vulnerability will be exploited by those who have forgotten their own capacity for tenderness and protection. The promise that broken things can be put back together resonates through his story with truth that transcends literal resurrection to encompass spiritual healing and emotional reconciliation that remain available to anyone willing to acknowledge damage while refusing to accept that such damage must define the limits of what becomes possible when love proves stronger than hatred and forgiveness demonstrates power greater than revenge. Rest now in the knowledge that somewhere in the spaces between sleeping and waking, between memory and dream, between the tick of mechanical clocks and the rhythm of hearts that remember how to beat with compassion, a gentle spirit maintains eternal vigil over all who need protection, all who seek comfort, all who dare to remain soft in a world that demands hardness as price of survival. Close your eyes when you are ready, and let the story of the crying child remind you that innocence, once awakened in human heart, can never be completely destroyed by any force that darkness might deploy against it, while gentleness, once chosen as response to cruelty, creates ripples of healing that extend far beyond any single life to touch countless souls across distances that span both geography and time. The child who cried has found peace at last. His tears transformed into streams of blessing that flow through dreams of all who remember that love is stronger than fear, protection more powerful than violence, and hope more enduring than any shadow that temporary darkness might cast across the landscape of human possibility and divine grace. Sleep peacefully, knowing that his story continues in every act of kindness, every gesture of protection, every moment when someone chooses gentleness over cruelty, love over fear, and hope over the despair that whispers lies about the fundamental nature of existence and our capacity for creating light in places where darkness seemed to have claimed permanent victory.